Chapter 37. The fable was right after all. It wasn't meant to be borne by a human. Anova didn't recognize her own voice. No. Leander's chest moved up and down too quickly. But you lived. It accepted you. When she didn't respond, he forced her face to look at his. Answer me, Anova. How do you know? Her voice was like fingernails scraping against rocks. She whispered. It hurts. Silent tears fell along her cheeks as he pulled her to him. In his arms, she allowed that broken part of her to chip off entirely. Against his chest, she told him everything. She told him about meeting the phantom of the Fey Princess. She told him about being hunted for the crown and accepting Hellmyr's protection in exchange for her hand in marriage. She told him about Alice's spell and the blood she'd taken from him. He was silent when she told him that, and what it meant. Blood from a Fey you love. She found she couldn't speak after that. It was the closest she'd admitted to loving someone since her mother had passed. But he wasn't saying anything. She couldn't stand the quiet. It had washed over them like a wave, and she was drowning in it. Forget it. She looked away from him, her teeth clenched against each other. It was a fool thing to say. Even more foolish since I thought you'd sent an assassin after me, which I still haven't been given an explanation for by either of the others, by the way. What assassin? What are you talking about? His hold was iron. She tried to pull away from him. This had all been a grave mistake. As if you don't know. She was carrying one of your knives. His jaw tightened. He lifted part of his shirt where his two blades were tucked at his waist, as plain as day. Anova stared even after he'd allowed his shirt to fall and conceal them again. She didn't understand. She'd broken the one that Liren had used to try to capture her. Her voice was rough. She had a knife like yours. Her gaze darted to his face. Leander. These are each of ours. Our family only ever had the two, Cadmus said. Anova shook her head. She'd assumed, just because the knife had looked similar, that it had been the same. What a fool I am. Cadmus seemed to understand her thinking now. She hated it. He said, You really thought? Come on, it's not as if you didn't entertain it. She pushed harder against his arms and said, Let me go. You thought I wanted you dead? Just because I wanted the blood crown destroyed? Release me, Faye, she said through her teeth. Her hands had gone to his wrists. If she applied enough pressure, he'd lose feeling and be forced to relent. Look at me. His hands found either side of her face. If I wanted more ridicule, I'd wake her up. She tried to jerk her head in the direction where Lycasta hopefully still slept, but she couldn't move. His eyes were too mesmerizing to look away from anyway. Listen to me, he said. Before, until recently, the reason that I lived was to kill the monster who slaughtered them. Ending the line of high queens and kings was a mere bonus. This version of him made her nervous, but she couldn't slip away from him now. And after we trained together, after I saw you every day, he said and paused. After I started to understand you, it was nothing more than pure luck that I discovered the true price for destroying the crown before we enacted our original plan. That one of us had to die to do it. I don't understand, Anova said in a breath. Anova, I stopped living to kill him, and I started living because of you. Her tongue felt too heavy to speak any longer. Such a thing was too much to accept. It made my decision to send you away, somewhere safer than Fae, all the easier. I would then be free to kill the High King myself and end the Blood Crown's reign with my own death, Cadmus said. Anova's hands dug into his wrists. She didn't like these memories. Safer than Fae, my foot. She had been handed over to Hinterfell. A plan which we will no longer be considering, she said through her teeth. You aren't sacrificing yourself for anything, and it's all a moot point now that I have it. She narrowed her eyes at him. Which brings us to another question. Why stoop to working with her? It's clear she's only here for your brother. Anova, he said, and the way he said it made her want to shiver. When I lost you after the High King died, I didn't know where you were. I didn't know who took you. I didn't know if you were alive. He breathed, and the air tickled her face. I was afraid of finding you too late. Her eyebrows pressed together. That wasn't you? I woke up in a room. She struggled with the memories. She hadn't been well at the time. And when she'd suspected she'd been captured, she'd escaped. His mouth was tight. We were attacked after the Crown accepted you. Nerium and I couldn't find you anywhere. He gripped her tight. Did they do anything to you? No, she managed. I got out before I even saw who it was. What about a name? A face? She shook her head. Not knowing their enemies didn't sit well with her, but the feeling was becoming familiar. Anova realized something then. She held her breath. One Fae was conspicuously absent. Where is Nerium? But Cadmus was shaking his head. For what I had to do to myself, I couldn't let him see that. He's been investigating leads for us. He'll back us up if we need it. The last time we spoke, he was in Farstar. Anova looked to the horizon. They'd lost too much time already, but she didn't want to admit it. To her own surprise, she wanted nothing more than to remain here by their cold fire and talk like this. But she didn't have forever. He'd caught her looking. How many days? He asked her. He didn't have time to complete the thought. How many days do you have left? It was something she asked herself too much. Maybe a week, she said in a tight voice. What? He'd spoken much too loud. Anova tried to shush him, but she was fairly certain he'd woken Lycasta by now. He held her there, forcing her to look him in the eye. Anova, what did you say? I've lost track of a lot of days. That's not enough time, he said for her. Not enough for anything. She felt like she couldn't get words out of her throat anymore. Fae always lived longer than humans. Her lifespan should have been a blink to him. Always. Young as he was for a Fae, he should have been expecting that. What's a week to a handful of decades to you? She said in an awful voice. It was always going to be like this. This is what we humans are. Brief. Not like this. A vein in Cadmus's jaw flickered. You deserve more. He held her face in his hands. We do. His use of we stopped her heart in her chest. She couldn't speak anymore. Cadmus held her against him in a silent embrace, and her face pressed into his collarbone. For perhaps the first time since she'd been told she had a month left, Anova let herself lose track of her time. Like grains of sand in a timepiece, they fell without regard. If she couldn't have this, then she would have nothing. Chapter 38. They came like an avalanche. Anova extricated herself where Cadmus had been holding her on a soft woolen blanket. This paradise between them hadn't been meant to last forever, she knew, but it still stung. Someone, or an army of someones, had found the three of them. As the horses bearing the enemy tore up the earth surrounding their shelter, Anova prepared herself for a fight. Lycasta was with them in a second, the supplies she'd gathered tossed on the ground when she saw them coming. She pulled out a small collection of knives between her fingers as her giant moth hovered above them. They were magicless during the day like this, but at least their opponents were as well. It was then that the arrows started whistling through the air around them. Cadmus was a blur before her as he deflected their arrows. Lycasta settled into a battle stance she'd never seen from her. Anova pulled free her own blades, but Faye, mounted on horses, met them at every angle. In the back of her head, the buzzing started. Not now, she bade the noise, but she'd never been able to calm the crown before. The battle had smothered them before she'd had time to understand it. The Fae closest to Anova leaped from their horses and came at her on her level. A silver-haired one with sharp teeth beyond her lips grinned at the sight of Anova's blade. "The human queen wants to play," she purred. Anova ducked for the arrow she expected from her opponent, but it never came. Instead, Fae arms came around her like a clamp. Her stomach dropped. They were trying to take her. That could only mean one thing. His voice soared over his squadron. "Surrender my queen to me, and I will consider sparing you of what I had in mind for you." Hellmyr had found them. Anova punched into the Fae lady's gut, who had nearly dragged her among his guards. She snarled at Anova as she slipped out of her grasp. Hellmyr continued. "I will still kill you, of course, my dear friend Leander." She heard his laugh over the sound of Cadmus slashing into the horse of his closest opponent. In front of her, Lycasta was barely holding the onslaught of his soldiers back. Pain bolted through her, and she snapped back from the Fae she'd been facing. It wasn't that. It was the crown. Sweat stuck her hair to her head. Why was it happening now? It wasn't as if she'd taken it off. Lycasta threw a look behind her at them and said, "Give her to them! Now!" "Not like this," Cadmus said between his teeth. Anova was surprised to find she agreed with him, even though returning to Hellmyr had been her plan. They hadn't even developed how they'd do it yet. They'd barely spoken. It was then that she heard the sound of something metal piercing flesh. It was like the sound of clothing ripping. Her heart was in her throat when she spared a look next to her to see him. Cadmus had taken an arrow to the shoulder, and red was already pooling under his clothes. On her other side, Lycasta's screams joined the chorus in her head. Anova couldn't see what had happened. Above the horses and the Fae that had closed around them, she knew Hellmyr was watching. She wasn't going to let them die for this. Not even Lycasta. It was time to end things. But when she caught Cadmus's eye, the look he gave her was almost enough to make her stay. There was no time to form a plan or even for a goodbye. But that didn't mean she was ready to leave him. "We're going to live," she mouthed to Cadmus. The skin around his eyes tightened for a moment, but she didn't get the chance to see his response. Pain, the kind that holds breath prisoner, flickered from the crown of her head to her feet. She was on her hands and knees before she realized what had happened. Somehow, Cadmus had kept the Fae away from her when she'd collapsed. She came to her feet with a lurch. Motion out of the corner of her eye stole her attention. It was the Fae who had fired into Cadmus's shoulder. He was readying another bolt. Anova didn't have time to decide. She shoved herself in front of Cadmus. "That's enough," she said. "Bring me the Fae King." She wasn't sure if they would obey her, but they parted, a wall of guards on either side, until he came forward. He was as she remembered, far too pretty for one so wicked. His cloak of raven's feathers cascaded down his shoulders and back until the end of it rested on his horse's romp. Hellmyr's eyebrows were near his hairline, but his voice was lazy, as if she had interrupted him from some pleasure. "You wished to speak to me?" "I'm coming with you," she said, shooting a look at the Fae guards around her who had accosted Cadmus and Lycasta. "But they leave from here alive." The Fae with the crossbow stood behind Cadmus, the edge of his next bolt pointed at the back of his head. Lycasta had been pinned to the ground by another one. Before Hellmyr could respond, Anova felt as if a lightning bolt of pain had entered her through the base of her skull. Her hands pressed tight against her temples. "What do you want? You already have my life. What more could you take?" The ground rose up to meet her, but before it did, hands steadied her back on solid ground. "Thanks." Anova's teeth bit into her tongue. It was Hellmyr who had helped right her. How did he get over here so fast? She blinked. Cadmus's jaw ticked with visible anger. The edge of the bolt was pressed tight against his head. "Where did you come from?" she managed to grind out. "I wasn't simply going to let you fall," Hellmyr whispered against her ear. She could feel his eyes dart to Cadmus and Lycasta. Before she could respond, he'd lifted her in his arms and started carrying her. "I can walk," she said between clenched teeth. "It's worth it for the look on their faces," he said, not even bothering to whisper anymore. The expression on his face slid off. He narrowed his eyes but kept his gaze straight as he carried her. He said under his breath, "Are you hurt? I told them not to hurt you." "No," she said in a tight voice. There was no need to explain. She was sure he knew what was going on. She added, "There was no need for all of this, you know. I needed to find you." He swallowed at her admission. He liked to hear it, she realized. The last time I saw him, I left him at our wedding. She looked away from the collection of faces staring at them. She couldn't believe she was feeling sorry for him. He was the king of Fae, after all. He took what he wanted when he wanted it. He helped her mount his horse first before he got on behind her. As his arms came on either side of her to hold the horse's reins, she tried not to think the thoughts she'd once thought about him. He sighed and brushed his mouth near her ear. "Are you sure we can't kill them?" "Yes," she said through her teeth. "Those are my conditions." Just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they were leaving. His guards insulated them on all sides. She hadn't meant to look back, but she couldn't stop herself. They were already gone. Chapter 39. Anova matched the stride of the Fae King as they stalked down the halls of Eastwoe Palace. On the way back, she'd told him how many days she had left. In reality, she had less. Pain was still flickering through her skull, but she ignored it. Hellmyr was already shedding his outerwear from the ride. He handed his feathered cape to an attendant as he said to none of them and all of them, "We'll be in my chambers. You are not to disturb me for any reason whatsoever." She could feel the eyes of the Fae on them. Perhaps her cheeks should have reddened at the thought of being alone with him in his rooms. She couldn't bring herself to care what they thought anymore, however. The door shut behind them as his guards took their station outside his rooms. Her pulse raced fast enough to make her dizzy. She said the only thing she could say. "At the wedding, you said you found a cure." She locked eyes with him. "Were you telling the truth?" She wished she had his senses then. She wished she could hear his heartbeat hasten. "Yes," he said. She could have slid to the floor, but she balanced herself with the back of a chair. His eyes didn't miss it, but he didn't move. "Hellmyr." It was strange to say his name again. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. Or him. She closed her eyes. "What is it?" He didn't answer at first. After a moment, he said, "You can only live if you accept the blood crown. You must allow its magic to become a part of you." She opened her eyes. That wasn't what she wanted at all. "What?" The word was forced out of her gut. "No, I have to destroy it. I need to end it." Her teeth grinded together. "Why can't you see that? Its existence only hurts Faye and everything around it." "Anova," he said, his eyes hard. "It will kill you. Whether you wish it or not, it will spill more blood to destroy it." Anova pressed her palm to her forehead. This was the answer. Live or die for her cause. But that's always been the question, hasn't it? Anova's breath rushed out of her. She thought she'd been ready to die when she'd killed the last High King. But that's because I was saving him, too. She didn't like this voice. Who was she saving with her death this time? Another ugly realization hit her. This time, if I die, he might too. Her stomach roiled. Cadmus had told her that he had chosen to live because of her. And if she died, he'd take the deal with Leander and Lycasta. "I can't," she said in a much smaller voice than she'd hoped to use. "It would never end. The assassinations." Her eyes darted to his. "They would eventually succeed." Inside, she was a coward. This, she knew. Now that she'd had a damning sip of hope, she wanted to live. Badly. "I know." His eyes darkened. "But it's not the only option, Anova." "What are you talking about?" His voice was careful. "I have a new offer for you." He turned from her to look through his glass doors to his balcony. "With no half-truths from either of us this time." He sounded as if his eyebrow was arched. She crossed her arms. Last time she'd seen him, he'd conveniently not told her that the rights to the blood crown might transfer to him too if they married. "Fine. What is it?" "Joint rule over Faye. We spread the risk of the crown between the both of us. And the power." He turned around and his face was straight. He wasn't joking. "We marry, but with no lies or manipulations this time. You will have my protection for the rest of your life." His voice went oddly hollow of emotion. "No matter who you choose to share your bed with." "Hellmyr." She wasn't sure what else to say. She felt as if he'd taken a spear to her stomach, and she couldn't figure out why. She took a step forward, and then another one. This was exactly how it was when she'd tried to seduce him. He didn't care if she used him. She took another step and forced the both of them against the wall, aware of how foolhardy she was being. He could have her head on a plate in a matter of seconds. He was the king of Fae. Why? Why are you offering me this? She asked. You should want to kill me instead. Her blood ran with some irrational emotion, but it was too late to stop herself. She continued. You could have all that and more in the blink of an eye instead of all this work to keep me alive and by your side. Anova hated saying it, but she hated being a burden even more. And she hated that he wanted her to use him like this. He hadn't stopped her yet, so her mouth was still saying things. But most of all, it doesn't make sense, she said. Why? Why choose me? Why keep your human novelty around for all this effort? His dark eyes blazed as they glared down into hers. Novelty? Is that what you think? His lashes brushed against his cheek. Was that anger? Somehow it made her madder. What else could I be to you? She said. He stepped even closer, and she could hardly breathe. What is it going to take to convince you? Looking into his eyes was like gazing into a snake's. She couldn't look away. But she knew there was something more that she wasn't understanding. A missing piece of the puzzle. Why did you go from taunting me as Cadmus's pet to this? The truth, she said. I know there's more to it, Hellmyr. I want the truth. He was silent so long that she wondered if he'd changed his mind. If he was contemplating how much more useful and easier to handle she'd be if she were dead. A lot, she knew. But a quick, startling smile spread across his face. So, you want the truth? The ugly, monstrous truth. The smile fell from his face. You're too clever for anyone else to begin with. Clever enough to get what I want, perhaps, she said. She wouldn't be distracted from her answers. Very well. Hellmyr narrowed his eyes. Some years ago, a Fey lord brought the youngling he was raising past the barrier and into the land of your people. It was there that, as he collected the dues from the bargains he'd made with the foolish humans, the youngling was allowed to do as he wished. He cursed the humans there without regard to the rules that the rest of our kind adhere to. Old men became lampposts. Infants turned to stone. He was cruel, malicious. Anova stared into his face. She didn't have to guess who this youngling was, though she hoped she was wrong. His teeth showed as he continued to talk, forming a bitter smile. Not that the Fey Lord took any issue with this, seeing as they were humans. They would revert back to their natural state once the moon passed, but they didn't understand. They wanted something done about it. Hellmyr paused. So, they consulted the only one of them who could hope to stand against a Fey Lord and his adopted son. A witch? Anova couldn't breathe. Alice, she gasped. Hellmyr gave a short laugh that didn't sound like a laugh at all. Not a young one. One wizened with years and fingers stained from poultices. Anova's throat tightened. She didn't like this. What happened? The humans begged her to kill the Fey Lord's young, but she refused. A life hadn't been taken, she argued. It would be unfit. So, the next time the Fey Lord brought the youngling with him to collect on his bargains, the witch lured the Fey child away and cursed him. She could only stare at him. He continued. For this Fae who so hated humans, he would be doomed to fall in love with one of her kind. A human. Only then would he find happiness in his cursed, half-filled existence. By the end of his story, his voice had changed from one empty of emotion to one that sounded as if he were drowning. "Hellmyr," she said in a breath. It was too much to understand. He couldn't love her. Not like this. It was too much. Her heart felt as if it were being squeezed and drained of blood. "I'm not done," he said simply. He was back to his strange, empty tone. "When the Fae Lord discovered what had happened to his claimed son, he took him back to Fae. At once, he sought an audience with the powerful High King. His son's life was ruined, he argued. He couldn't live a normal life cursed by a witch to love a human," Hellmyr said. The High King considered the matter and agreed with him. Something must be done. There must be consequences. So, together with his Kingsguard, they came to the human lands and killed the last witch. Anova backed away from him several steps. "No," she said. Hellmyr wasn't saying anything. "That was Alice's mother," Anova said. Her voice broke. "But that didn't solve anything, did it?" "It didn't." Hellmyr's voice was low. Her hands ran through her hair, running up against the cold metal of the crown. "It was all too much." "When I watched him bring you to Fae, I was angry. I didn't want anything to do with a human in case you were the one." His eyes flashed in the dark like a cat's. "And then, the more I saw you, the worse it got. The more I realized." "And all this time?" Her voice was almost silent. He stepped closer to her. "I hated you for it, you know. I hated that you could hold this power over me. I hated that you reminded me of the foolish, proud Fae who raised me and the witch he had killed because of me." A long breath dragged through her. She remembered when she'd first met him in the Boundary Forests, the hate gleaming in his eyes at seeing her. The feeling was mutual. She swallowed. She hadn't even chosen to say was rather than is. He was close enough to touch her now. He did so, brushing his thumb along her jaw until he pushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "But you became more than the human come to remind me of my curse. Even if you were here to undo me, I started to want that too," he said as his hand traced the back of her neck. Her blood thundered through her. She couldn't accept this. Another Fae had already stolen what remained of her heart. His voice was dull and quiet. She almost didn't recognize it. "Anova, I need an answer." Anova felt like she was being dragged down to the opaque depths of the ocean where it was quiet, but suffocating and inevitable. She envied the bottom. In a single motion, she took a step back and left the room. Chapter 40. A day passed in which she didn't speak to him. In that time, however, he sent a messenger to her rooms. It was phrased as a request, but she knew it was meant to be taken as a summons. To her relief, Della and Maris seemed to have been taken care of here and simultaneously left alone by the cruel Fae. She supposed she had Hellmyr to thank for that. Or maybe he knew that she wouldn't have forgiven him if something had happened to them in his palace. Anova knew she should have been saying something to Sarah by now, but she couldn't seem to parse through her thoughts enough to form any coherent answer. Her nails dug into the chair she gripped. She'd woken up screaming again, but this time Sarah hadn't checked on her. Perhaps she knew by now that the bolts on the windows were secure and that it was the Blood Crown's doing. Hellmyr's words still ran through her brain. You can only live if you accept the Blood Crown. You must allow its magic to become a part of you. And then, of course, there was his proposed bargain. She fought back the memory of him touching her skin. He'd requested her presence at sundown in the palace's grand hall. She had little doubt that it had to do with what he'd told her about the cure for the blood curse. "My lady?" Sarah said. The skin around her eyes tightened. It must not have been the first time she'd asked that. Anova was aware she wasn't acting normal. Anova blinked when her next step came to her. She knew what she needed now. She needed to talk to Cadmus. What will he say? If my death is the only way to destroy it, what will he do? All at once, she dreaded knowing. But she had to do something. I need to get a message out to someone before tonight. Please. She gripped Sarah's shoulders. Can you think of any way to do that? Sarah's human eyes widened. Any way, Anova repeated. If you can think of a way, even if it sounds ridiculous, please tell me. Sarah was silent when Anova released her. Anova suppressed a sigh. Short of asking Hellmyr for help, there was no other way then. And she couldn't let him know that she was trying to talk to Cadmus. Breath dragged through her as she went to her window. She was on her own then. It was then that she heard a door close. Sarah had left her too. What do I do? She could leave, but where would she go? She had days. Maybe. Anova sank to the floor and pulled her knees close to her. The motion triggered the pain hiding in her skull. She swallowed the cry of pain that rose up inside of her like an air bubble from the bottom of a lake. There had been no answers here, or none that she could use. Allow the blood crown to persist, become a target for the rest of my life for power-hungry Fae. Her heart skipped a beat. Rule beside Hellmyr as his wife? And then there was the other option. Die and destroy the crown. Her nails dug into her scalp as a new wave of pain washed over her. How was she supposed to accept the blood crown when all it wanted to do was to kill her? The door to her room opened, but Anova found that she either couldn't or didn't want to move. It mattered not which it was. If it was her assassin come to kill her, then her decision would be made at last. But it was Sarah who crouched beside her. Anova could only stare at what was in her fist. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Sarah stiffened, her lips tight together, and Anova thought better of the question. "Actually," Anova added, "never mind. I needn't know." Anova took the vial without another word, and Sarah left just as silently as she'd entered. She stared at the vial, swishing the liquid within. There was no doubt. It was Fae magic. The intention behind the magic is set when it's summoned from the moon. Anova considered this. Wherever Sarah had gotten this, some Fae had likely intended to use it to communicate outside the palace with someone else. She'd stolen it from a guard, likely, or even someone higher up. Anova realized it then. It must be for her sick grandfather. Her stomach swam. She hadn't even asked her about him recently. This wasn't only about her. This was about Fae and humans and who ruled this land. It was about wars and peacetime and witches. Anova put the vial on the floor. She was being selfish. Sarah had risked much to be able to talk to her loved one. But I have to talk to him. I have to know, if it's best. She couldn't bring herself to finish the thought. No, she would only use the smallest amount of this fey magic. Then she would return it to Sarah's room and promptly forget that the girl possessed it. Anova first put an empty wash basin before her, but thought better of using it. With the vial tight inside her fingers, she froze in front of the floor-length mirror standing near her bed. She swallowed. The last time she'd used stolen magic, it had resulted in unpredictable effects. There was no guarantee that this would work. In fact, there was a strong possibility that this would backfire. Sarah hadn't said what the fey magic would do. She'd only assumed it had been an answer to her pleas. After she unstoppered the vial, her hand hovered over the surface of the glass. Anova allowed only a dribble of it to slide out of the bottle's mouth. Where it touched the glass, it spread until it coated the entire surface in a cloudy white. She replaced the cork inside the vial and, with one extended hand, touched the mirror with the tip of her fingernail. When it had no ill effects on her, she pressed the edge of her finger to it carefully. The surface was much cooler than it ought to have been, but there was no change other than that. "Cadmus, please, I need to speak with you." With a firm touch, she pushed against the surface, but it was as solid as it was before. Anova closed her eyes. It wasn't going to work. The pain flared again at the ends of her nerves, taunting her. It was as if it had watched and waited for her lowest point possible. She slid along the side of the mirror until she came to the floor. Her teeth gritted together, but she couldn't hold back the gasp of pain that escaped her throat. It washed over her like a wave and pulled her down with it. Sweat coated her back, and she focused on taking shallow breaths to keep breathing. "What am I going to do, Cadmus?" she whispered against the glass. "Where are you?" Anova jerked upright, her heart pounding at the sound of his voice. It had been too clear to be a hallucination. Or had it? "Anova," Cadmus asked again. She came to the mirror with the fogged surface, and her palms slammed against it. It was still solid, yes, but she could hear him as clearly as if he was on the other side of the glass. "The fey magic. I'm here," she whispered against it. "In Eastwoe Palace. I'm using fey magic, I think." She swallowed. "I stole some." It was easier than explaining the full truth, and who knew how long the magic would last. "Are you okay?" There was an urgency to his voice that made her pulse race. She knew what he was truly asking. "Are you alive? How much longer do you have? What's going on?" "Are you alone?" she asked. There was a pause. "Alone enough, yes," he said after a moment. "I've been trying to get to you. The barriers on fey magic he's placed on the palace are difficult to break." "Thank you, Sarah," Anova said in silence. She owed her more than that for passing her some of the stolen fey magic she knew. "What have you found out?" she said. "Nerium came back," he said. Anova's heart soared. "He found no trace of the elixir." She sank lower to the ground. Suddenly, she was glad he couldn't see her. But what had she expected? "Anova?" His voice rose. "Are you there?" She blinked. She realized she hadn't answered. "I'm fine." "You're not," he said. She narrowed her eyes. She thought she'd been careful in concealing her voice. "Did that bastard do something to you?" "No, it's not that." Her voice closed around the words. She couldn't ask him what to do. Not anymore. Anova was too afraid that he would choose the crown's destruction over her life. But she needed to do something. She needed some other way out of this. There's someone who doesn't want this. Someone who would do anything to destroy the crown. She started again. Cadmus, I need you to do something for me. What is it? Anova couldn't believe she was asking for her help, but she was at the end of her options. Lycasta's moths are trained to track, aren't they? She breathed, considering how to ask the questions she needed to. How does that work? They smell using their antennae. They're trained from birth with the help of magic to be much more sensitive to smell than other moths. Their size helps too. Leander paused, but only for a moment. As long as they have something with the scent on it, they can usually find the person. Something with the scent on it. She frowned. Anova had only the clothes on her back when she'd escaped her wedding. And then it came to her. The sachet of salt I took from her room, she said. I left it behind at our camp. That will have her smell on it. Anova realized she needed to explain herself further. I need you to find the witch from the wedding. Her name is Alice. The salt was hers. He was silent another beat before he said, This is someone you trust, then. She wondered if she did. She decided to be honest. I don't think it matters anymore, Anova admitted. There's no one else who can help us. A noise from outside her bedroom stole her attention. There was someone else inside her suite. I have to go, she said in a tight voice, already pulling away from the mirror's cold surface. Wait, Cadmus said in a rush. Did he have a cure, or was it a lie? It wouldn't destroy the blood crown, she said flatly. So no. She didn't have time to stay and hear what he said next. There was a furious knocking against her door. Sarah said, My lady, there's... Anova jumped to her feet and the room swayed around her. But instead of Sarah, the Fae King stood before her. His eyes narrowed on her as she backed into the mirror and tried to partially block it with her body with a casual motion. She hoped against hope that it wasn't still cloudy. He took in her form. What's going on? Nothing, she lied. I have to do better. She stepped forward. Either the mirror was still enchanted by the Fae magic Sarah had stolen, or it wasn't. Her arms crossed before her chest. Don't you usually have your guards do this part? She cocked an eyebrow. The dragging while I kick and scream? Somehow, his eyes were on her and not what was behind her. His thumb propped her chin up and he held her gaze on his. Because I wanted to remind you, he murmured. Of what? She glared at him. Your power? Your position? Of how much you want to do what I say. He smirked, revealing some of his two sharp teeth. I can tell by how your heart throws itself against your rib cage. Hellmyr, she growled under her breath. He wasn't being fair, outing her like that. But it had worked. The Fae King had turned away from her and the mirror. He hadn't even looked behind him to check that she was following. Pompous ass. Against her better judgment, she followed him out of her bedroom. Hellmyr took only a moment to examine how she'd showered her personal effects about her suite. It was less decoration and more disaster, and it unnerved her to see him look at the mess so closely. Looking for something? She asked as she passed by him on the way to the door. The sooner they got this over with, the better. He smiled his Fae smile. Just enjoying learning more about you. He held the door open for her, and she walked through it with grinding teeth. If you're taking this as a yes, you should know I haven't decided on a response yet, she said as they walked through the palace's halls. You're wrong. He looked at her from the side of his eyes. Or at least partially. Your heart already has. That's not true. she said while adding, "And stop cheating. I'm just nervous about anything that involves this damned fake crown." Next to her, he shrugged. "If you say so. Besides." He was suddenly in front of her, blocking her path with his body. Anova reached for the weapon at her waist and realized that it was gone. "First, you will live." The darkness in his eyes smoldered as his lashes brushed against each other. "Then, I'll make you beg to marry me. And more." Heat raced across her cheeks and ears. She hated how easy it seemed for him to rile her. She pushed past him, her hand going reflexively to her waist before she remembered what had angered her in the first place. She spun on him. "Did you take my sword and daggers?" They were the first things she'd stolen in too long. For that reason alone, she missed them. The fact that they were her only defense here was fuel to the fire. When had he lifted them? She pushed this concerning line of thinking aside to deal with it later. Hellmyr lifted his shirt. Tucked inside the waist of his pants were her sheathed daggers. Inevitably, her eyes roamed to what they were shoved against, the bare skin of his lower stomach and the muscles underneath it. "I can show you your sword, too, but—" No, don't," she managed to get out. "Just give me the daggers for now." She held out her hand. She'd have to clean them, of course. Perhaps Sarah would be able to find a good metal polish when she got back to her rooms. Hellmyr let his shirt down again. "No. I'm not going to try to kill you," she promised. "So give them back." His arms crossed. "I'm afraid not. Not until we've tried this. You'll get them back at dawn." Anova felt her eye twitch. Briefly, she considered fighting him for them. Before she could convince herself of the merits of doing so, she pushed ahead of them again. "Fine," she said. "We'll do it your way." Best to get this over with, then. She wasn't sure when she'd agreed to even do this. She certainly hadn't agreed to any of his other proposals, including his marriage proposal. She breathed to calm herself. Hellmyr had cut up to her again and led them to the doors of the palace's great hall. Anova wasn't sure what she expected inside, perhaps other than an empty hall. But she hadn't expected the figure standing in the moonlight before them. Chapter 41. The Fey Lady raised her arms. Pale moonlight fell into her palms like water. It was the last Anova saw of her before white flames consumed Lotharia. Hellmyr pulled Anova back. She wasn't sure when she decided she would rush towards her, though it concerned her to see him so nonchalant while his mother burned before them. "Just wait," he said next to her. When Lotharia emerged, the flames parted for her. She was utterly untouched. As she passed, a flame caught on a single strand of her raven hair. It ignited immediately and sped towards the top of her head before the Fae caught the errant flame and extinguished it with moon magic. "You either control magic or it will control you," she said, stopping before Anova. "Including yours." Mine? She had no magic. "This is different." "It doesn't matter that ours is different from that which is contained in the crown," Lotharia interrupted. "Witch magic, Fey magic, it doesn't matter." Anova looked sidelong at Hellmyr. He hadn't mentioned involving his mother. "In the archives," Lotharia continued, "you wanted answers. You wanted to know about the crown." She tilted her head. "Or is this no longer the case?" "I do," Anova said. "But that doesn't mean I want to use the crown." "Hellmyr has told you the only way for you to live is to accept the crown. This means accepting its magic and allowing it to become a part of you, Lotharia said. She stepped back a few steps. We don't have time to waste. You'll either leave now, or we'll start already. If you still want that, you'll stand at the marked place on the floor. We'll see about that, Anova muttered, but she did as she asked. Hellmyr went to the opposite side of the room, watching her with an inscrutable expression. Suddenly, Lotharia's white flames died. She stood in the ashes, allowing more moonlight to pool in her palm. The moon gives us her gift. Our link to her is where our magic comes from. Lotharia allowed it to pour on the ashes where green shoots began to form like a small army. But the Blood Crown's magic comes from the earth. She shot a look at her. As I'm sure you've noticed, it can be accessed any time. Like witch magic, Anova guessed. Correct. Lotharia's golden eyes narrowed on her. So you need to be able to control it. You need to find something to concentrate on to bring it out in a safe way. Anova's fists tightened. It can only destroy. I've tried. Lotharia's gaze was piercing. You haven't tried hard enough, then. She started forward some steps. Anova hadn't forgotten what had happened when she tried to heal Lycasta. It hadn't been pretty. Is it not believable that something created from spite and hate could only harm? Anova said. I'm not using its powers. Lotharia and Hellmyr shared a look. At once they both snapped their hands. The air around them shimmered into spheres. You're not going to get past our barriers, Hellmyr said with a flat expression. Try it. Anova breathed and thought of the angry buzzing at the back of her skull. She thought of the pain that gathered at the ends of her nerves. Her leashed mountain cat. It didn't take her long to find it. It came readily to her like a dog called to a meal. As soon as it was in her palms, it burst like one of Alice's explosives. She was drowned in white light as the screams came to a height. She was on her back. Hellmyr helped her to her feet. His hands remained on her for a moment longer than was necessary. He brushed the hair out of her eyes. Are you okay? She stepped out of his arms. I'm fine, but this isn't going to work, Hell. You're right. With his arms crossed against his chest, he leveled a look at her. It's not if you keep thinking that. Anova shook her head. You don't understand. It's not some little thing you can move and manipulate. It's not like... You're fighting it, Lotharia interrupted. You need to accept its presence. She grinded her teeth together. Why did she have to put up with two of them now? This isn't working. I told you, she said. Hellmyr met her glare with one of his own. Bathed in eerie moonlight, he looked the part of a powerful Fae king. Would you prefer the alternative? The skin around his eyes tightened. Giving up? Seconds stretched between them. Fine, Anova managed to say. However, in truth, she wasn't so sure anymore. They returned to where they'd been before and protected themselves with their magic. Anova didn't have to try hard to summon it again. As before, it lingered at the edges of her perception. Dark and hungry, waiting to be unleashed. She felt its need to consume. It was evil, hateful. There could be no other word for it. After all, this magic was an abomination created by a blood curse. It wasn't supposed to exist. But then again, neither should I after becoming its keeper. Anova breathed. It came to her at once, overwhelming and suffocating. Unearthly sounds filled her ears, and her vision danced around her. Anova tried to pull it back in like a horse by its reins, but it wasn't working. Lotharia was shouting something. It took her several seconds to understand any of it. Allow it to become a part of you. You need to do this. Now. I'm trying. The noises produced by the crown drowned out her voice, but she didn't need Lotharia to know that it wasn't working. The energy ballooned inside her like a dead, bloated fish on the surface of a lake. Through the primal screams that seared her brain like a fish on a frying pan, she heard Hellmyr's voice. You have to accept it. It's the only way you can hope to live with it. The crown's screams grew in volume. It didn't like being ignored. I can't hold on to it any longer, Anova said through her teeth. It's going to destroy everything here if I don't let it go now. Then destroy it, he shouted. Through the haze that was her vision, she saw something that turned her stomach. Hellmyr had stepped forward so that he was steps before her. With a wave of his arm, the barrier on the air surrounding him dissolved. Hellmyr! Lotharia shrieked. What is the damned fool doing? Anova could barely keep herself upright. The pain demanded to be acknowledged. It wanted to be unleashed. It wanted to hurt. Stop it, stop it, stop it! He moved his head slightly as he spoke to Lotharia. It's my decision, Mother. I'll take responsibility for it. His eyes cut back to hers. For whatever she does. Stop! She tried to beat it back down, to smother it back into submission, but it started taking more of her in bits. First, it took her hearing, then the feeling along her extremities. Her vision danced around her, taunting her. Hellmyr didn't move. She couldn't contain it. She sipped air, but she was sure that she'd be standing for only seconds more. Which will it be? It was absurd. How could she accept something like a blood curse? It was everything she reviled. Blood, revenge, oppressive power. Fae power. Anova saw him still. He stood before her, arms at his sides, empty-handed. When I watched him bring you to Fae, I was angry. I didn't want anything to do with a human in case you were the one. And then the more I saw you, the worse it got. The more I realized. I hated you for it, you know. I hated that you could hold this power over me. I don't want it. I don't want any of this. Hellmyr's voice was mixed in with the cacophony. Even if you were here to undo me, I started to want that too. Undo me. Anova didn't realize she'd been screaming until the sound cut off. Her chest heaved with breaths, but she still felt as if she couldn't get enough air inside her. Her palms were against the ground. She didn't want to look up in case she'd done the worst. But it wasn't like last time. A shiver ran across her spine. It went silent, both the screams and the pain. Finally, she looked up. To her surprise, the grand hall remained as it had been moments before. Her heart froze in her chest. Hellmyr was rushing towards her. In one motion, he helped her off the floor. Do you realize what you did? Anova opened her mouth and closed it again. She couldn't quite believe it. Her voice was scratchy, but she spoke anyway. I called it back, she said. Controlled it. Some distance away, Lotharia was watching. Anova blinked. A slow smile crept along the Fae lady's features. She'd done it. The crown was quieter than it had been since she'd woken up with it. Her body shuddered, and Hellmyr pulled her close. Her voice was hoarse and barely audible. I'm going to live. I will live. The more she said it, the more she believed it. She stayed in his arms while the moon passed from the porthole above. For the first time since she'd donned the crown, she cried. Chapter 42. Once the sun rose, guards escorted Anova back to her rooms. For the first time in too long, she couldn't feel the pinpricks of pain hiding inside her body. She knew they had more work to do, but she couldn't deny the signs of progress. For once, the blood crown didn't feel like a splinter buried underneath her skin, a part of her and alien all at once. Hellmyr had been right. Whether she liked it or not, this was the answer. All along, she'd been fighting the hybrid of magic that lived inside it and had suffered for it. Anova sank into a plush chair inside her bedroom. She could still destroy it if she wanted to. Now it was her choice again. Even if she still didn't know what to do about the future of the blood crown, at least she had a future again. Her lids sank as her blinks slowed. Although the pain from the blood crown was alleviated for now, last night had taken its toll on her. Exhaustion pulled her deeper into the chair's cushions. A thought occurred to her. I need to tell Cadmus about this. I need to speak with him through the mirror again. But she didn't get up. Her body demanded sleep too much for that. Once she woke again, she would first ask Sarah if she had any stolen Fey magic left. After that, she needed to practice with Hellmyr every waking moment from then on. While they'd found a way to stop the blood crown from killing her, Lotharia explained that she likely needed to work for several nights yet to fully accept the crown's magic inside her. Was this the right decision? Anova wished she knew. A quiet yet persistent voice inside her whispered something else. You've already decided what's right anyway. You've already decided to accept Hell's bargain. It's the only way this can work while the blood crown exists. Anova's eyelids parted. There had been a knock at her bedroom door. With muscle memory, she found the knife at her waist. She thanked her stars that she'd forced Hellmyr to surrender her weapons to her before she'd retired to her rooms. But before she could stand, Sarah's voice came from the other side of her door. It's me, my lady. I've brewed you some hibiscus tea. May I come in? Anova breathed again as her body sank back into the cushions. Yes, Sarah, of course. When Sarah opened the door to her bedroom, she carried inside a tray with 2 steaming cups. Anova breathed in the herbal scent and couldn't deny to herself that her timing was perfect. She accepted the cup Sarah handed to her and leaned back into the chair. She looked down into the red tea as she thought of her words. Anova could feel Sarah watching her. She cleared her throat. Thank you. Not for this, but... Anova bit down on her lip. She blamed the slip on Hellmyr's awful manners. For the tea, too, I mean. But thank you for helping me earlier. Sarah wasn't saying anything. Anova's gaze shot up again. I'm sorry. Sarah shook her head. I'm not offended. Please enjoy the tea before it cools. Anova's eyebrows came together, but she did as Sarah suggested. Anova cursed silently. She'd promised herself that she wouldn't pepper Sarah with questions about the stolen Fey magic she'd mysteriously possessed, but her curiosity was getting the better of her. There was that, and the fact that she needed it again. She swallowed as warmth spread down her throat. Maybe if I can get her to tell me who she got it from, I can get some myself this time. Sarah, she started. I know I shouldn't ask you this, but I need to contact someone outside the palace again. Anova paused. I need to use more Fey magic, and frankly, I'm not sure where you got some. Well, how? She corrected. It was then that Anova realized what was bothering her so much. Sarah was watching her, not in a usual way exactly, but in the way that one watches a dangerous animal from the other side of a cage. Anova bit into her cheek. She shouldn't have asked. The Fey magic must have had a high price. She traded too much to get that, she guessed. Is there... Anova's tongue refused to cooperate with her any longer. Her heart pounded, and she had to lean back into the chair's cushions. Oddly, Sarah seemed at ease at last. A cold sweat broke out along her scalp. What's going on? Anova rushed to stand but didn't get far. Her legs buckled underneath her, but before she could hit the floor, Sarah caught her and lowered her back to her chair. Her limbs were too heavy to move, but that didn't stop her from trying to grab the sheathed weapon at her waist. She didn't have the strength to speak, but inside, she screamed at her body to move. It's her. It's her. It's her. It was always her. But she couldn't move. I was concerned when the poison didn't act at once. I've never seen anything like it in person, Sarah explained as she looked upon her dagger with a slight frown. The Fae told me the first effects would be instant. There was too much in what she'd said for Anova to concentrate on, though her mind was still as sharp as it had been moments earlier. It was in the tea. She saw Sarah's cup, untouched and still on the platter she'd brought it in on. The signs had been there. When had she started to become so lax? Her mind ran wild with a storm of thoughts. The crown isn't something to want, she gasped. Sarah's expression remained flat. I don't want the crown. I'm not trying to kill you. Anova's stomach sank. That was worse. She needed to figure out her motive and who she was working with. There was no question that someone wanted her dead. Many Fae did. But which one was it? Sarah got to work putting up her weapons and then clearing the tea from where Anova had been drinking it. She needed to do something, but she could barely move her mouth enough to speak. Anova remembered their first conversation. She tried to get up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. Not even the magic inside the crown responded to her pleas. 3 years of service here, and my grandfather's life is saved. Your grandfather, Anova managed. She stared at Sarah. That was the answer. This Fae was threatening his life and had forced Sarah to do this. Sarah placed the tray back on the table. Her shoulders shook, and at first Anova thought it was from sobbing. But she was laughing. Sarah jerked over to look at Anova. The amusement had drained from the girl's face. I don't have one. That was a lie. I thought you'd be able to tell when I made it up. Anova's tongue was getting heavier, so instead of trying to speak, she stared at her. She went to Anova's window. Early sunlight streaked through it. I did bargain with a Fae, though. As she slid it open silently, she said, She was right. You trusted me more than the others just because I was human. I couldn't believe my luck when you dismissed the other servants. Anova stopped breathing. There could be no other. Through the open window came a red and orange moth as delicately as a petal blown inside. The insect landed on Anova's nose, its bead-black eyes staring down at her. The urge to bite at it like an animal surged through her. Lycasta. Her maidservant had emptied one of the teacups and held above it the vial of Fey magic that Anova had used yesterday to communicate with Cadmus. The liquid poured inside, and the moth left her nose to perch on the edge of the teacup. As Anova watched the moth sip the fey magic, she thought back to when Sarah had given her some of the same substance. Why did she do that? Why help me if she was only going to assist Lycasta in killing me? She felt strangely calm as she thought it through. Perhaps it was because she could do nothing else. Sarah almost didn't help me that night. It wouldn't make any sense for her to do so after all. Whatever Lycasta promised her, it's certainly valuable. The more she thought on it, the more she realized. Sarah wasn't without compassion. In that moment, she'd felt for Anova when she'd begged her for help. And yet, she was fully cooperating with Lycasta today to ensure she killed Anova. Fae aren't the only strange things living here, Anova considered with a shiver. Anova breathed in a gust of air. She would need all her strength to speak. But now that she couldn't move and could do nothing else, she had to do it. She had to try to change her mind. It was, quite likely, the only way out of this. Anova pushed down the panic rising along her gullet. It would do her no good to succumb to it, no matter how tempting it was. Why? The word rasped from her throat. Sarah stared back at her. Her lips were tight and her eyes wide. She looked like the young girl she'd defended that day against the Fae servants bullying her. Anova knew she understood what she'd meant. But another voice responded. Oh, she's still able to speak. It was Lycasta. Anova looked around as well as she could, but she didn't see the Fae lady anywhere. The moth landed on her nose again, and she realized with an awful feeling that the Fae magic was allowing her to speak, hear, and see as the insect before her. Lycasta added, A few more hours will take care of that. The shapes that looked like eyes on the moth's wings stared down at her too. Try killing me, Anova said through her teeth. It took her entire concentration to glare at the moth on her face. She heard Lycasta's sharp laugh in her ear. She would have traded anything to be able to swat away the moth at that moment. Two sets of eyes stared her down as Lycasta said, I'm not trying to kill you, human. No, that would run counter to the entire plan. Anova's heart beat faster at her admission. She hadn't forgotten when Lycasta had tried selling her to the highest bidding Fae for the honor of killing an unconscious human girl. It hadn't ended well for the Fae lady, and she would remind her of it. She would rip her apart when she could move again. Anova would ensure Lycasta never forgot crossing her. She swam in the idea of her revenge, drawing it out. It helped sate the panic, if only for a few more moments. Bad idea, Anova managed to growl. Lycasta sounded like she was remembering the same thing. It's quite a good one, actually. Her voice sobered. And the only way any of this will work for us. Us. She means herself and Leander. Before she could say anything to that, Lycasta said, No, I'm not trying to kill you. I don't want the blood crown. In fact, it matters not to me what comes of it, so long as your death isn't traceable to me. Anova couldn't breathe. The moth moved along her face until it stopped at her ear. Lycasta's voice was low. They will find you unresponsive. The poison Sarah administered was a very low dosage of belladonna. It would be enough to kill a human child, but for a human adult, it's just enough to slow your heartbeat that most would consider you dead. No. It couldn't work. One of them would hear her heart eventually, would realize what was happening. It doesn't have to work for very long, she realized. Anova felt something wet one of her cheeks. Belatedly, she realized it was a tear. Cadmus, she whispered. They both knew what would happen if she was declared dead. Anova wanted to be angry at him, that the possibility of her death could do this to Cadmus, but all she felt was a hollowness in her chest. Lycasta's voice was tight. If you are declared dead, Cadmus will agree to complete the spell. He'll save Leander from death in exchange for his own life. She almost sounded remorseful. A fog washed over her, though she fought it. If nothing else, she had to cling to her awareness. It was all she had left. The moth climbed higher, so it clung to the center of her forehead. She could feel its soft wings against her skin. Poor mortal girl. Sleep, Lycasta bade. May you slumber through this final part of your existence. Chapter 43. Anova woke up. She wasn't sure whether or not that was a good thing. While she couldn't move or even open her eyes, Anova heard raised voices around her. She remembered Lycasta's last words to her. The Fey Lady had intended for her to sleep through this, but she'd woken up. Aware, but unable to move or speak. Worse. This is worse, she decided. With a jolt, she realized Hellmyr was the one yelling. If you value your life, you'll start speaking, healer, Hellmyr growled. What are you talking about? She's not dead. Her heart has failed. The Fae tasked with healing her responded. You can hear She heard a sound like a gurgle and realized Hellmyr must have done that to the other Fae. I'll be the one deciding that, so I think it's time you did your job, Hellmyr said in a deadly, quiet voice. A sheen of cold sweat had dried to her face. I'm alive. Please, Hellmyr. But it was as the healer said. With every second that passed, she felt a new wash of dizziness assault her. It was a wonder she clung to awareness. The depths of her slumber beckoned to her. How easy it would be, just like falling asleep. It could be as Lycasta had suggested. Painless. Easy. No, I need to live. I want to live. Anova had to signal to him that she yet lived, but she couldn't even force herself to breathe. Every so often, a trickle of air slipped through her nose and into her throat. The Fey healer was trying something else. She could feel his warm hands on her skin. She realized then that the healer's skin wasn't warm, but that she was much too cold. She tried to find the magic that lived inside the crown, but it was silent of both power and pain. None of the healer's efforts helped. She drifted, lost in her fog again. Hellmyr. Lotharia's voice pierced the haze that had descended on her brain. She was unsure if hours or days had passed. Hellmyr didn't respond. Hellmyr, it's been long enough. They'll start to wonder when they haven't seen her in many more days. Some have already started asking. Lotharia was silent for many minutes until she added, The rumors have spread. His voice was strained. I'm not giving up. Something clattered around in the room they were in. I'm alive, Anova chanted in her mind. Don't you realize? The blood crown is still here. When he spoke again, his voice was different. It was quiet, though it had an edge to it. Help me understand. It was working. She was starting to change. Anova's heartbeat felt more than glacially slow. It felt like it was stopped for good. Change? Another too warm hand touched her. The lids of one of her eyes were pried apart, and she glimpsed the ceiling of the room she was in. The ceiling was too ornate not to be somewhere inside Eastwoe Palace. In her periphery was Lotharia staring down at her. She tried to move her gaze to look anywhere, to at least suggest that she was alive, but it felt like trying to push an island through water. "It's clear before you. We were wrong," she said simply. Its magic was ultimately incompatible with her. Lotharia frowned as she looked down on her. Otherwise, her murderer would have gained the crown by now. It would have claimed them, Fae or human. She paused before adding in a barely audible voice, "That's what did this, Hellmyr." Lotharia's eyes shut as if she were in pain. Anova realized why a moment later, when a wordless yell reverberated throughout the space. It quieted as the seconds passed, like a noise traveling through a tunnel. Hellmyr was gone from the room. The Fae Lady carefully closed Anova's lids, and she removed her hand from her face. All was silence, and the coldness came for her once more. No, I have to stay awake. As Anova struggled to cling to consciousness, she understood what Lotharia had meant. That's what did this, Hellmyr. They think the crown killed me at last. But there was more to it than that. Their words echoed in her head until she gleaned more meaning from them. They think their efforts to save me killed me. The cold hovered around her, pulling at her extremities like a shadow monster. Its fingers slipped everywhere that she couldn't cover. Like a pall, it threatened to pull her back into a dead slumber. Her thoughts were starting to splinter once more. It was growing harder to remember the conversation she'd overheard moments ago. She needed more rest. But what was waiting on the other side? Would it truly be more dreamless sleep? Or had death come to collect like the spurned lover given hope? I want to live. I want to live. Chapter 44. The silence was broken not by a sound, but by a feeling. Anova didn't know what it was until it started to consume her. It was more than the absence of cold. It was fire. It was all around her. Smoke filled her lungs, stifling her slow, laborious breaths. But she still couldn't move. To go from pitiless cold to such heat was a nightmare that Anova hadn't known existed. She wanted to writhe. She wanted to scream. But there was nothing. Past the jackal-like laugh of the fire all around her, she started to hear noise. Distantly, a haunting melody came to life. Music from stringed instruments filled the air around another sound. It was a voice she knew too well. Hellmyr. Memories struggled to reform themselves in her brain, but they remained buried, heavy like bodies in a lake. His voice was loud, even compared to the roar of the fire around her. "Get him!" Hellmyr snarled. "Someone get him now!" What's going on? But her heart wouldn't budge from the stutter that had woken her. Despite the heat, the blood in her veins had slowed and cooled too much. Belladonna, she remembered. She'd been poisoned. Now who had told her that? If I don't remember, it's not important. What was important was that she was going back to sleep. She was finally going to rest. Nevertheless, a whisper came to her in the silence. What if it's not sleep? What if this is death? If she could have, Anova would have frowned. So what if it was? Hadn't she contemplated this moment over and over again within the past few weeks? Wasn't she sufficiently ready for it now? But the whisper wouldn't stop. Remember what you said. A gasp of smoky air filled her. She wanted to live. She was going to live, no matter what. Understanding flooded her anew. Anova realized what was going on, even if she couldn't open her eyes. Repulsive pain seared through her, starting at the tips of her feet. They were burning her. This was her funeral pyre. Anova tried to scream, but nothing came out. She couldn't unlock her jaw to let it loose. Hellmyr's shouting was almost louder than the fire now. "I'm alive! Please, someone notice! I'm not dead yet!" The sudden realization that they were burning her alive assaulted her. Anova would die here, and whichever random fae had lit the fire would acquire the new blood crown, and this cycle would begin again. And like Casta, the memory sparked inside her. She'd been the one to orchestrate this, and she'd used Sarah to poison her. Her heart felt as if it were shriveling. She'd trusted Sarah, but that had been her own fault. Infernal heat began to wash over her, starting at her extremities. Flickers of lit ash fell on her, lighting pieces of her clothes aflame. She had moments now. She was going to live. She had to. Even if she had to fight and claw her way there, just as she'd always had to. She felt her teeth grit inside her skull. She was going to move if it was the last thing she did. It may very well be. Anova fought against her heavy limbs, taking them to war. But nothing else budged. Her breath was slow to move through her. Just a budge. Anything. When that didn't work, she turned to the crown. Curiously, they hadn't taken it from her. Or they hadn't been able to pull it off her head, more likely. Anova reached for the raw power inside it. It didn't answer. Panic clawed up her throat. Suddenly, she felt something brush against her face that wasn't flame. Her heart felt properly stopped. "My love, my stubborn Anova." It was Cadmus. His words were much too soft. "It's okay. I'm here now." She tried to look at him, but it didn't matter. Cadmus had realized she wasn't dead. Her heart soared in her chest, and she couldn't tell if the feeling was like flying or falling. He'd heard her faint heartbeat. She was going to live. The heat was consuming, flying across her clothes until it pressed uncomfortably to her skin. The agony raced along her body, searing her. They needed to move. Now! Instead of that, however, Cadmus held tight to her. Something was soaking through her clothes that was thicker than sweat and warmer than it too. Blood. No. This wasn't supposed to happen. No! Anova screamed inside her head, screaming at the reality before her and willing it to change itself. Precious seconds slipped by like sand under the sea. Her eyes flew open at last, but it was too late. Cadmus was slumped against her chest. He wasn't moving. His blood had pooled across her, extinguishing the smallest of the sparks that had landed on her. It was thick on the air, the strange taste of fae blood and the heavy pall of smoke. His head of raven hair blocked most of her vision, but she could see the darkening sky above. The last tendrils of evening light were receding. Anova sucked in another gasp when she saw the volume of blood that was coming out of him. He'd carved himself open where his heart was. The bargain. No, she couldn't think on that. She had to act quickly if she were going to save him. Anova willed her stone joints and muscles to move. All she needed was to move a finger or a toe. Then the rest of her would follow. The fire danced across them like a demon, flicking and darting out more and more like it was testing the limits of her pain. But she wasn't sure if she had a limit. Cadmus, please, Stay with me. But the words wouldn't come free of her heavy tongue. She could still do nothing other than watch as his lifeblood left him. Her eyes bounced in every direction as the fire consumed more. Pain raced through her, and the crown felt as if it would melt her head. It was then that the last of the day must have passed from the horizon. A light sparked in the air above them. But in the seconds before its flash, she saw something else on the air. It was a single moth, its wings dappled black and white over orange. It had been watching them. Lycasta. A plume of choking smoke rose up before her, and Anova saw her. On the back of one of her monstrous moths, Lycasta flew. A primal anger rose up out of Anova so fast that it made her dizzy. Her heart began to thunder blood through her like a horse's gallop. The magic on the air formed into something like a spear, and it pierced Cadmus's back. Anova couldn't think. Before she could understand how it was possible, she hauled herself upright with a lurch. Now that her heart worked again, the pain was unbearable. She swallowed a scream as clothes melted against her body. I just need to bear it a little longer. Anova tried to jostle Cadmus, but he didn't respond. Cadmus, she whispered. Please, you can't do this. You can't. She couldn't get out the words. Even though she could move, she couldn't even crawl out of the flames. She didn't have the strength to move him, she found. She took in a series of shallow breaths. She needed to get them both out of here. Then she could figure out how to help him after that. But something other than blood was spilling out of him now. A bright light was leaking from the wound at his back. She was distantly aware of other fae shouting. She couldn't see past the flames and smoke, but they must have seen her by now. Anova didn't hesitate. Her limbs were weak, but she forced her hand over the spot where the spear of magic was embedded inside him. If you answer to anyone, you answer to me, she snarled at the crown. But it wasn't working. Anova bit down a scream of pain as she smothered the flame licking along her dress. Her entire body was a pool of sweat. Her head swam, but she pushed herself harder. Her hand formed a fist. Pull it out, she bade the wild magic within her. She wasn't aware of when she'd started to cry. Fix this. The light grew brighter until it blinked out of existence suddenly, and the spear was gone with it. Anova slithered from under Cadmus. With shaking hands, she tried to heave him away by his shoulders. The fire had reached him. Her lungs fought against the pall of smoke around her. She was on a wide platform somewhere. With a weak kick, she scattered much of her bed of branches at the flames. Even though they fed the pyre surrounding them, it was better to surrender the tinder before she caught fire in earnest. For a brief moment, the smoke cleared as a light burst above them. Arrows flew into the air, but they all missed the Fey Lady. Lycasta's moth lifted ever higher, but not before Anova saw someone else on the insect's back. She blinked before understanding what it was that she saw. It was Leander. Alive. Coughing up a lung, but alive. Lycasta won. She got what she wanted. He thought I was dead, and he allowed them to switch his life for his brother's. Anova went numb. The spell to switch their souls had been completed, and the fae she loved was dead. He's not. He can't be. A part of Anova's brain had processed what had happened, but her body hadn't. She continued to try to heave Cadmus out of the funeral pyre. She didn't realize until she was on the ground that the smoke had filled her lungs entirely. She wasn't breathing air anymore. Cad! His name turned into a gasp, and she swallowed ash. There was no denying it any longer. She was suffocating. Screams and shouts filled the air as thickly as the smoke had, and she wondered if this was the Blood Crown's last gasp of life, too. "At least you're going to die with me," she considered with a spiteful heart as she thought of the crown. "With us," she amended after a moment. Her thoughts were cut short as more ash filled her mouth. She felt as if she were a fish, gasping for air on a ship's deck, one eye hopelessly to the sky. Dead already. Anova curled closer to Cadmus. There was no moving him. Sweat clung to her back, and she had no energy left to smother the flames that snuck at their elbows and feet. She closed her eyes and faced him. "I love you," she told him silently. Anova felt a tear fall along her cheek. If only the poison had worn off just moments earlier. No, she realized. The problem hadn't been the poison. It had been her. It wasn't only that she'd trusted the wrong people. She had. But she also hadn't trusted the right one. The one that had truly cared about her. The one that wanted her to live, even if it meant letting go of his dream and the only thing that had motivated him to action after his family's deaths. Remembering what she'd last said to him hurt more than the agony inside her body. Maybe it was the knowledge that the pains living inside her would only last a few moments longer that relieved their sting. Did he have a cure, or was it a lie? It wouldn't destroy the Blood Crown, she'd said flatly. So no. Her last words to him had been a lie. Anova had been unsure of his allegiance, unsure whether or not he would have preferred her dead and the crown destroyed versus her alive. Alive, and she would have been using the crown's cursed magic, allowing it to thrive inside her. If I had only told him about Hellmyr's solution and about the progress I was making with the Blood Crown, he wouldn't have believed my death so easily. Anova, you fool. She tucked herself closer to him. She couldn't have lifted herself off the ground if she tried, but she could do this. There was no more air to breathe, and her lungs cried out. But she pushed that feeling down, as far down as she could. "I'm sorry." Hands were on her. They'd found her. When they touched the burns, she screamed. She was alive. Even if she didn't understand why life had chosen her instead of the one lying next to her. Chapter 45. When Anova woke again, she noticed the difference at once. She was more than hot. Everything was hot. She was in a room she didn't recognize, blessedly alone. A curtain was drawn across a single window, and a low table was pushed close to her bed. A glass of water sat on top of it. Her blood raged through her, but she needed to prove to herself that she wasn't still drugged with belladonna poison. Anova lurched up, dragging the blanket off her. But when she shifted against the covers barely touching her, a wail escaped from behind her clenched teeth. It all hurt, and this time, it wasn't the Blood Crown's doing. A breath of cold air settled inside her. As far as she could see, her limbs were wrapped tight in gauze. A gasp rose to her lips, but she suppressed the urge to make more noise. She couldn't afford to forget that there were enemies here. They had outmaneuvered her once. It didn't matter if Sarah was still here or not. If Lycasta was smart, she'd have had the girl killed. It's what I would have done. These thoughts helped to distract her from what Anova saw under her bandages. She'd started to peel them from her skin, and they came away heavy with some Fae-made ointment. Her fingers shook, but she couldn't stop herself. Blisters dressed her legs where she was least injured. They ranged in size from freckles to ones the size of her thumb pad. She couldn't help but think that they looked like little suns. Anova sucked in something between a laugh and a muffled cry. Of course there was worse. All along her arms was a bright, concerning red area, and a layer of skin that shouldn't have normally been visible. Her burns were in various stages of healing, ointment still plastered to spots, but too much of it looked like this. Fresh as when she'd been burned on her funeral pyre. And yet, the aches in her body told her that she'd spent days in this bed. Anova swallowed. She didn't have to hear it from a healer to know that even Fey magic had its limits. With that thought came another. She sank against the bed. Anova bit down on her lip to stifle a cry of pain from the movement. He's gone. Suddenly, Anova couldn't feel the way that air brushed against her wounds too harshly when they were uncovered. She couldn't feel them at all. She stared straight ahead at the window, not quite seeing it anymore. Cadmus. She'd been a damned fool all this time, but he'd been worse. Her hands fisted some of the blanket next to her. She wanted to be angry at him. She wanted the anger to feed her like Feast could have. He'd taken the weapon to his own flesh. Anova was shaking, but she didn't care. He'd done it himself. And for what? That lying she-Fae? What a stupid, backwards-ass reason. But the answer sat deep inside her. It was quieter than the anger, so it took her longer to hear it. He'd thought that the blood crown had destroyed both of us. That I was gone, and it was to be buried with me, no longer able to crown another high king or queen. It was what he wanted all along, and not at all what he wanted, if his words are to be believed. After that, he had the chance to make someone else happy, to save his brother's life, to make his own mean something. I suppose he took his chance. Anova's hand ached from clenching it. Slowly, she opened her fists. Even if he'd been a fool, she'd been a worse one. A ragged breath filled her, and she smudged away the tears on her cheek. She'd heard footsteps in the hallway leading from the room. The decision was quick, easy even. Anova's hand wrapped around the glass of water in nearly the same instant that she slammed the side of it against her bedside table. Tiny shards rained to the floor like snow powder and were washed away by the water. The bigger pieces clattered to the floor too, except for the shard she still held in her shaking grip. To the Fae, she said, "Don't come closer, or else." His eyes went to the broken glass and back to her unbandaged limbs. "What are you doing?" She recognized him from his voice. This Fae was Hellmyr's healer. Or one of them, anyway. He took a step toward her. "You're in no state for this." "No," she snarled. "Don't come any closer. Not until someone brings me your High King." She could see the debate on his face. Even if she possessed the blood crown, she was only a human, and a weakened one at that. Anova realized with a jolt that likely no one other than Lotharia and Hellmyr knew that she'd been able to access the powers of the blood crown. Blood surged along the surface of her wounds. She was pretty sure some of them were oozing. She didn't know how deep Lycasta's network went here. Anova remembered that a servant other than Sarah had arranged her and Hellmyr's wedding date. She wet her lips. She was going about this the wrong way. She needed to convince them she was as she appeared to be, a human clinging to tenuous life, one they'd nearly killed accidentally. At once, Anova dropped the glass shard to cringe back as what she hoped looked to be a fresh wave of pain took her. This farce was easy because it was the truth. The best kind of pretending. A low wail escaped her tight lips. She allowed the pain to roll through her, and, unchecked now, it took what it wanted. The gasps were real by the time the Fey healer was by her side. His eyes were narrowed on her, but his voice told her that he'd expected this weakness. "No moving anymore," he said. "It's not necessary for you right now. Someone will be here at all times going forward." The Fae's hands were fast and his touch light as he applied new bandages to her limbs. Through a mouth she barely opened, she said, "All right." But her cries had brought more of them in. She caught a glimpse of Hellmyr's guards at the edge of the room. Without taking his eyes off her, the Fey healer said to them, "It's fine, but bring the king." Anova couldn't allow the emotions to cross her face. It wouldn't have made sense with the part she was playing. But she felt equal parts pleasure and surprise at the ploy's success. It had worked. She breathed through her nose. "Focus," she bade herself. "Plot your next move." She swallowed the panic rising in her throat. There was always a next move. First, she needed to get somewhere safe. But she couldn't let up the act in front of these Fae yet, not until she understood more of the situation. He was inside her room before she had time to come up with more of a plan. His grackle eyes were ringed with dark circles. She'd rarely seen any of the Fae look tired, and the sight made her pause. They stared at each other, he only taking his eyes off her to watch the healer finish wrapping her limbs in new bandaging. As soon as he was done, Hellmyr announced to the room around them, "Out." His face was unreadable. When they were alone, he asked, "How are you?" Anova couldn't even pretend to laugh at the question like she probably would have under other circumstances. She was as far from fine as one could be. So she decided to ignore the question. There was too much ground to cover, too much to do, and she'd hardly been awake for half an hour. His name came to her lips, unbidden. Cadmus. She nearly lost her nerve then, but she had things to do before she broke down entirely. Soon, she promised her frayed nerves. Soon she would allow herself to become lost to the sorrow and anger threatening to swallow her. The question rushed from her lips. "Do you know about the belladonna?" His jaw tightened. "I found out afterward." He didn't have to elaborate. She knew what he meant. He'd only discovered that after they'd tried to burn her in the pyre. The reminder of those moments made her eyes water in pain, but she bit down on her tongue to stem her reaction. "It was Sarah, my maidservant," Anova started. "Gone," Hellmyr said, pacing around to the side of her bed. "I suspect either the she-fae arranged for her departure in the confusion, or she killed the girl herself." Anova's back thudded against the bed's carved headboard, though everything hurt to touch her skin. Had she wanted the girl dead? She wasn't sure. Anova's hands tightened to fists. She had facilitated Cadmus's sacrifice. So yes, maybe she did. Either way, she wanted to find out. And there was still the matter of Lycasta. Anova jolted up, though the movement made an involuntary gasp come to her lips. "I need to find them," she told him. "Sarah, Lycasta." She swallowed. "Leander." At his name, she saw something flicker in Hellmyr's eyes. She remembered that he and Cadmus had once been friends. "I'll send my most trusted to hunt them," Hellmyr said. His eyes moved away from her, and his jaw clenched. "Though, if they have any sense, they're well away from my reach by now." Anova realized then what it was that she saw in Hellmyr's strange expression. It was fury. Fury and something else she'd never seen in him. I need to go, too, she told him. I'll know how to find them.
Anova, you're not doing that.
Hellmyr's eyes were hard on her.
You're not going anywhere. Not like this.
Maybe he was right. She felt his eyes on her limbs, the bandages. How pitiful she must have seemed to him. And maybe he was wrong. Her teeth gritted as the pain washed over her anew. She wasn't just going to sit here while those responsible for leading Cadmus to his suicide fled for the most remote part of the world. But even when we find them, what then? Revenge? A voice inside her cooed. Hellmyr must have seen something in her face because his next words were dulled of emotion.
I know about the spell.
And Anova, he said, pausing as if to study her reaction. She wasn't sure what he saw, but he continued.
He's gone.
Anova tried to keep her breathing even when he said the words. He was silent as he watched her. She tried to tell herself that she'd known this already, but it was difficult to tutor her body into agreeing. Cadmus was dead. And when Lycasta died, Cadmus would still be dead. Everything hurt to move, so instead of crawling into a ball on one side like she wished to, she closed her eyes. Blood or pus or something oozed from one of her burn wounds, but she didn't care. She'd lived. She'd survived the belladonna and the blood crown. But for what, exactly? There was Hellmyr's offer from before. The blood crown would persist, but then, so would she. It would be more than that. What he wants is a wife, someone to rule beside. Is that what she wanted? Maybe she could ensure no one abused the power of the crown by controlling it herself. The thought jolted something inside her. The blood crown's magic can be more powerful than a regular phase moon-given magic. It works differently. Maybe something can be done. Maybe the spell can be reversed. Leander's words returned to her.
The spell only worked because of who we were to each other. Magic like this must be accepted by the other party.
Anova knew who she needed then. Her blood pounded in her ears. Even if she couldn't do much like this, there was someone who could. Someone she'd sent Cadmus to find before Sarah had poisoned her. She chose her next words carefully. When you were burning me, they got past your guards. It was a guess, but she'd pieced together the story by now. At her words, Hellmyr stiffened. Guilt, some part of her realized. He feels guilty. Good. Maybe I can leverage it. I need some information out of him. All three of them, Anova said significantly. It was another guess, but it had worked for her so far. His face was smooth of emotion, but she saw the truth in his eyes.
I'm not releasing her, if that's what you're asking, he said.
Her stomach clenched. At once, she understood. So, Cadmus did find Alice. She'd been with them when they'd interrupted my funeral. And he captured her. I need her, Anova said.
I'm not going to do that. She's too dangerous.
Hellmyr's eyes flashed.
When they got here, she tried to destroy the entire palace. I found the evidence on her.
He shifted.
The witch has demonstrated over and over that she is a danger.
Then release her to me under supervision, Anova said between her teeth. When Hellmyr didn't say anything to that, a gust of breath left her. He didn't trust her. Well, it was about time. Then what are you going to do? She shot up, slinging her legs over the side of the bed despite the pain it brought. Keep her here until she dies in your dungeons? Hellmyr stared back.
The thought has crossed my mind.
She wondered if they were still talking about Alice or not. Heat rushed across her skin, and she cocked her head at him in a challenge. You seem to be in the habit of keeping prisoners, she said with bared teeth. Hellmyr crossed the distance between them in a blink. With a finger lightly pressed under her chin, he lifted her gaze.
If it makes you hate me,
his lids lowered as he looked at her,
then hate me.
Anova's heart galloped into a new, frenzied pace that she wasn't sure was due to her anger or something worse. She focused on the hate, ignoring what else may have lingered within her. But before Hellmyr left, it left her body for a fleeting moment. She knew what was behind his vehemence and possessiveness, even if she did hate him for it. You didn't kill me, Hellmyr, she said. Not by the crown or the fire. I'm alive. She wanted to say, I'm fine, but that would have been a blatant lie. He stopped, not turning to address her, and said only,
I could have.
The voice sounded entirely unlike his own. After a pause in which she said nothing to that, he left. Chapter 46. In the first 2 days, Anova had memorized her guards' schedules entirely. In that time, she'd successfully convinced her Fey healer that to move was pure agony for her. The downside was that she had to keep the charade in place and resist even the smallest stretches. Her legs grew sore from inactivity, and her arms ached. Just a little bit longer, she promised her body. During the day when they left her mostly alone, her most ugly sobs escaped from her lips. In those moments, her guards would look away. Not yet, she bade herself during those moments. Later, she promised. Later, there'll be the chance for breaking down entirely. For now, she had a date with revenge, and she was going to get some answers from a witch who owed her big. The shard of glass from the cup she'd broken rested underneath her pillow. When the healer and her guards weren't looking, she ran her thumb along it to test its edge. When she slept at night, her nails honed its edge into something like a weapon. By the 4th day, it was time. Daylight wasn't when she normally liked to do something like this, but it was when she'd be least watched in this place, and her captors would be generally without their magic. She rubbed the tiredness from her eyes. Anova wasn't sure when she'd adjusted so well to the Fey way of life, sleeping during the day and waking at night. For a moment, she remembered how Juris had charmed a jail guard to break her out of imprisonment in Urbess. Her heart thundered in her chest. I'll come find you. Soon. Anova frowned for a moment. She was making promises she couldn't keep again. Abruptly, she rolled to her side, clutching her knees to her chest. Pretending wasn't hard when a real screech of agony rose to her lips from the sudden movement. The healer, she said between gasps. I need the healer. Out of the corner of her vision, she could see her 2 guards glance at each other. Hellmyr had ordered them to never leave her alone, but he'd also ordered them to never be alone with her. Undoubtedly, it was because of the blood crown and the target it pinned her with. Anova waited with held breath to hear if this would be easy after all, if they would both leave her instead of risking that one would get his hands on the crown.
Send Garrick here on your way to the healer, said one of them at last. I'll stay.
I'll be sure to do that, responded the other one. A warning. If I can't pry it off the head of this nearly dead human, then neither can you.
And as easily as that, she was down one Fae guard. She knew she probably should have feared being alone with one of them, but she didn't. There wasn't much time, especially if another guard or the healer was coming. Especially if she planned to free more than herself this day. The shard under her pillow sliced into her palm with ease, wetting her cotton covers. Ignoring the pain, she formed a fist as she brought the hand against her side to make it seem as if the blood was from elsewhere. "No, one of my wounds opened," she gasped. Her eyes went to her soul guard. "Please," she whispered. "Help me." Red seeped from the wound, winding down her arm among the pattern of burns she wore. She swallowed. It was more blood than she'd expected to draw. The guard came to her side as she'd asked, but she saw at once this was a mistake. As his sharp eyes took her in and his mouth smirked, recognition shot through her like a potent drug. She never forgot the face of someone who tried to kill her. Anova rolled off the bed before he could get a proper hold on her. The Fae snarled and finally pulled free the weapon strapped to his belt as he came after her. Breath rushed out of her as she clutched the piece of bloodied glass in her palm. Dizziness assaulted her. She hadn't moved so much in several days. His blade missed her by a few hairs. Anova's breaths came heavier and heavier with each of his lunges. She was out of practice. "You faked your death," she realized. This was one of the Fae who had attacked her and Urbess, one who she'd thought they'd discovered dead beside his co-conspirator, one of Hellmyr's other Kingsguard. We only saw the face of the female, she considered. The other body was too mangled to identify. We'd assumed it was him. "Once I was declared dead, I didn't have to answer to the moth tamer who had wanted us to kill you," the Fae guard said above her. He held his sword staff low in a threat as he said it. "After that, it was an easy matter to integrate into his forces again. He was desperate for more fighters after the fire in Westfold." His weapon came in a wide arc for her. Anova forced her body to cooperate, though tears sprang to her eyes. Her body needed a reprieve, and sooner or later, she knew it would get it. Her tongue was heavy in her mouth, but she spoke anyway. "You were waiting for this," she accused him. He showed his teeth and paused for only a moment. "I was waiting to smother you in your sleep, actually." The smile faded from his face. "But I knew better than to expect an easy death out of the human who slew the High King." He crouched to aim better for her. "No, human. I've been preparing for this moment in all my nights since then." "I'll be happy to save you the trouble by killing you first," she said through her teeth. Neither of them had time left for this, and she felt they both knew it. From where she'd been driven to the ground, Anova hooked her leg on his as he aimed for her abdomen. He faltered, and her adrenaline coursed through her. This was her opening. Even if she'd been trained for the last few weeks in Fae by the son of a respected Fae general, she'd thrown her first punch on the streets of Urbess. Anova's fist was fast and fleeting like an insect's bite. The glass cut further into her palm where she'd held it, but it had cut into his skin more. Red splattered from the cut along the arm that held his weapon. She didn't have time to celebrate, though she couldn't help but smile. It didn't stop him. Rather than reacting to the pain by clapping a hand to the injury like most would have, the guard's severe eyes flashed. Anova tried to scramble back and come to her feet, but the reach of his weapon stopped her. The blade hung above her head. His eyes glossed over the black, twisted piece of metal on her head. "You don't deserve this power, or the honor," he said. "No, our folk need a Fae ruler, and not a puppet king." Anova sucked in a breath of air. With a push, she rolled out of the way, but not before his blade grazed the peeling skin along her arm. She swallowed a scream. "No one deserves it," she said through clenched teeth. "Power like this always corrupts." Corruption? Is that what you think is important in Fae? The Fae gave a short, strange laugh. Your human morals are of little consequence here. Everything was on fire. Her vision started to run. Her body was failing her at last. Anova waited for the strike she knew was coming, for the pain that would eclipse all others. Instead, the edge of his blade hovered at her throat where her pulse pounded against it. Anova couldn't move without opening her throat. There was nothing to do besides meet the gaze of the Fae who was going to kill her. Leaderless and directionless. Did you honestly think Fae would be better this way? He asked. He laughed again. No, of course that's not it. You don't care about that at all. He narrowed his eyes as he refined his guess. You killed the High King because you despised Fae like him, not for corruption or any of your noble excuses. Anova's mouth hung open. Of course, she hadn't only killed the High King because she'd hated him, but she couldn't seem to make the words come out of her mouth to say it. Before she could respond, the Fae guard shoved the blade forward at her throat. It hadn't been Anova's choice. Ever since she'd woken from the belladonna poisoning, the crown hadn't felt the same. It didn't clamor as it had before. She'd taken it as a sign that it had settled, but maybe something inside it had broken, even more than it already was. It happened in a blink. Just how the crown's attacks had been before, the light was sudden and piercing. Heat washed off her in a wave, and she felt she would peel her skin off herself if she continued to feel this warm for a moment longer. The crown will kill him, she realized in those seconds. An image flashed before her face. It was Cadmus as she'd remembered him, alive, too conniving for his own good, and an expert at chipping down the walls she'd carefully crafted in her life. You hate us. You hate me. It's clear in the way you speak and act. No, that's not how it ended, she reminded herself. It had ended with the both of them in each other's arms. She hadn't hated him. Ever. And then the other Fae's voice came to her. You killed the High King because you despise Fae like him, not for corruption or any of your noble excuses. Before the crown's brutal magic charred the body of the Fae guard who had attacked her, she called it back to herself. Anova shuddered from the force of it. It was like breaking the surface of water while a chain tried to drag her to the bottom of the sea. When the blinding light faded, they were both on the floor. Anova pushed herself up. The residual energy from the crown's magic flooded her limbs, and she felt almost drunk with it. Across from her, the Fae guard was on his side facing her. Quicker than a blink, his weapon was in her fists. Useful thing, she considered, hefting its weight. She had no time at all left, so she sprinted to the door, ignoring the way her skin felt like it was on fire. Until the moment before she left the room behind, she hadn't been going to check. But she had to now. Anova threw one last glance at the Fae on the floor. He hadn't moved from the spot. Even though she had no time for this, she stopped there and held her breath. Ever so gradually, his chest rose and fell. She hadn't killed him. Anova wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. Chapter 47. Anova may not have been able to shift into invisibility like perhaps the Fae could, or melt into the shadows, but she hadn't needed magic to make herself unseen before. When she heard them approach in the palace's halls, she shoved herself behind staircases and pedestals. But the Fae who ran to her rooms weren't looking for a sneak thief, or even a dethroned queen. They were looking for the burnt, disfigured human girl who they'd nearly killed by mistaking her as dead. To them, She might as well have been dead already. No moving anymore. It's not necessary for you right now. Someone will be here at all times going forward. As she emerged from her hiding place in the palace's halls, Anova considered how her assassin had been the first person to treat her like a threat after her belladonna poisoning. She would have laughed if she'd been able to anymore. Maybe that's why I wanted him alive. Anova pushed herself harder. Her breaths were shallow. The pain flared in her body again, though by now, she was well used to such things. She had no time left, but she had to get them out. Anova found their shared quarters with ease. Her body heaved with pain, and she leaned against their door. Della, Maris. Anova dared not raise her voice any louder. After a moment, she gave a soft knock and hoped her luck would hold for the 1,000th time. When the door opened, Della only took a moment before enveloping her in the tightest hug she'd ever received. Anova squirmed from the pain of touch. Della, please, she gasped, and the woman released her hold on her some. Della launched into an explanation faster than Anova could take a breath. He said we weren't allowed to visit you. He said that you needed to rest first. Of course he did. Anova held her mother's friend close. I'm leaving the palace. For good this time. But they'll drag me back once he finds me, so it has to be right now. She swallowed. Are you coming? Is Maris there? Della took only a moment to consider it and nod. Without taking her eyes off Anova, she called. Maris? You hear all that? But Maris was already coming through the door. I've had our essentials packed since the wedding. She stopped and looked Anova in the eye. This is about him, isn't it? The one who loved you. Something lodged in Anova's throat at the way she'd said it, but a noise down the hall interrupted her answer. We should go, Maris said for her, and they ran. On the way down, Anova explained her half-formed plan to them in fits of whispers. They remained quiet, their breaths almost silent huffs. It sounded nonsensical to her own ears, but Anova had to believe in something. Because if she didn't, there would be nothing else for her to believe in. Her heart tremored inside her for the possibility. They waited on the corner of a hallway for a group of his guards to pass. As they rounded the corner, Anova froze. The others had heard it too. The sound of 2 Fae guards speaking filled the hall. They were close, and the guards they'd narrowly avoided were too near in the other direction to turn around. They were stuck. The magic of the crown prickled across her skin. She looked to her companions, but she couldn't risk hurting either of them. I have to fight my way out for us. Anova swallowed. I'll do it. Stand behind me. But the other 2 didn't move. They stopped like they'd been talking. Before she could ask, Maris's hand found her shoulder. We'll head them off. There's a split in the hallway. Once we distract them, go. Anova's mouth hung open. I can't leave you to them. It's too dangerous. Come on, Nov. You can't hog them all for yourself. Della's mouth turned up in a mischievous grin. You're not the only one who can charm a Fae boy. The guards' voices were almost louder than their own now. In her ribcage, Anova's heart thundered. She looked at the 2 women who had become not quite like her own mother to her, but something similar. There was no time for a goodbye, but Anova squeezed their hands as tears dotted her eyelids. I'll come back for you, she promised. I swear it. Anova flattened herself against an alcove as Della and Maris stopped the oncoming Fae guards. She dared not take a breath until she heard their eventual steps away from her. Anova wasn't sure what she'd done to deserve those 2. She took Maris's orders and sprinted the rest of the way. She knew where the dungeons were from the last time Alice had been imprisoned there. When she reached the entry room into the palace's dungeons, Anova froze. There were no less than 3 guards in the space, but she didn't have time to deliberate or fight. This time, she had to deal with them. At once, they surged forward to stop her. Now the energy buzzing inside her was easy to find. It willingly came to her fingertips, her leashed mountain cat. Not to kill them, to stop them. Anova had no idea if the magic inside the crown cared about what she wanted. What am I thinking? It's not as if it's sentient. She gritted her teeth, trying to focus and call the blast back to her before it grew too much in power. The buzzing all around her quieted, and the light cleared from her vision. Slicked in sweat, Anova rose from where she'd been crouching near the ground. The dungeon guards were littered on the floor. After she found a ring of keys on one of them, she didn't pause to check if they yet lived. Distantly, she thought she heard the reverberations of boots or shouts in the palace above her head. They'll have discovered what's happened by now. And Hellmyr was no idiot. As Anova passed the empty cells, her eyes scanning them for any sign of the witch, she saw a different familiar face. She didn't have time for this. But there was something to the Fae lady's face that made her stop. It was strange to see a Fae so bruised and disheveled, even if it gave Anova a sick sort of satisfaction to see one of her enemies so beaten. Anova found the key to Liren's cell and stepped inside before she could stop herself. This could be the last time she got her answers, even if it was too late. Lycasta was your master, Anova said. It was an assumption, but it was the only one that made sense now. At her approach, Liren's head shot up. Her hands had been bound at her back, and an iron chain kept her near the wall. It was Anova who had kept Hellmyr from allowing her to die on what was supposed to have been their wedding night, on display for all of Fae to see. But that didn't mean they were on the same side. Liren almost killing her had seen to that. I never saw her face. She could always find me. Messages were left for me on Birdwing. Liren tried to shrug, but it was more a shudder. And the knife? Anova asked. I know it was made in imitation of another. It was much too similar to be a coincidence. You saw it yourself when you broke it, Liren said. I know not why she chose that one for me to use against you, though it broke easily enough. Unlike the other Fae here, I know my blade craftsmanship. All I can say is that it was hastily made. Anova stepped forward a few paces. From the start, it was Lycasta who had wanted to drive her and Cadmus apart so she could have Leander. That she understood. But she still didn't understand the Fae before her. Why? The word came out of Anova's mouth, less a question and more a statement. Despite training for it most of my life, someone else had the pleasure of killing the old High King. Despite her state, Liren reluctantly lifted her chin to Anova like she was lifting a glass of wine to her. Anova hadn't responded, but her almost assassin kept speaking. My mother was one of the king's consorts. She wasn't one of his favorites like the king's mother, Lotharia. She rolled the Fae lady's name around in her mouth. I wanted to kill him for hurting her. What Liren had told her felt much too familiar. You're one of his heirs? It was all Anova could say. But she didn't remind Anova of Hellmyr. Liren reminded her of herself. Liren laughed. Not quite. The old bag wouldn't have let me walk around with my head so freely if that were so. But he didn't, Anova said. Not at the fate. Her fake mirth disappeared. Liren was silent. And I saved you from him, Anova said in her mind, but not out loud. And then you tried to kill me. Instead, she said, "Where is she now? Your mother." Liren was silent in answer for that, too. She should have been gone from the palace by now. They were searching for her as she stood there like a fool. And perhaps she was still acting like a fool, but she removed the key to Liren's cell from the others. She held it in her palm. The cold bit into her warm skin. "I never want to see your face again," Anova told her. And she dropped the key at Liren's feet. She was gone before she could change her mind. If nothing else, she hoped Liren proved to be a distraction for the guards after her. But that's not why you freed her, is it? Anova ignored this voice. She ran past all the other cells until she came to the one that housed the witch the last time she'd been Hellmyr's captive. Her heart jerked in her chest at what she saw. This time, Hellmyr had made sure that Alice couldn't have broken out of her cell. Circling the witch's wrists and ankles were metal chains that were welded to her cell's walls. A bigger shackle hung around her neck, keeping her close to the edge of the dank room. The witch had been bound much more securely than her own assassin had been. The witch's gaze jerked up at the sound. Alice's dark hair was a mess, and her clothes, clearly well made and well kept at one point, were smudged with dirt. Her eyes were like a cat's as they looked at her in the darkness, silent and unblinking. The witch took in the burns across her body and the reds seeping from her wounds from the fight with the Fey guard. She didn't look surprised to see her alive, but maybe she hid it well. Through the barred window, she heard her speak. "What is it you want, Anova the burnt girl?" Anova stepped forward, one hand on the metal door as she looked back. The sounds of the guards' footsteps were unmistakable now. They were coming. "A lot, and you're going to help me get it." Her tongue ran over her teeth. None of the keys on the ring were working. Dread curdled in her stomach. Hellmyr himself carries the key. She had the Fey guard's weapon, and she could use it to pick the cell's lock. It was her only hope now. Sweat poured down her spine as her hand grazed the handle of the blade. She'd done this many times before. Their shouts bounced across the wide walls of the dungeon's bowels. They'd found her. Her fingers were sticky with sweat as she fumbled with the lock. There's no time for this. Something lodged in her throat. The first of his soldiers were visible as they ran towards her, the dim light of the dungeons catching on their drawn weapons. Anova shoved her palm against the grimy door as she ordered Alice. "Get to the far corner." What if I hurt her? What if I can't control it? Will it have been worth it then? But she felt as if she were watching someone else do these things. The light gathered in her vision until it drowned all other images away. Anova closed her eyes as the heat spread through her. She focused on the feeling of the magic coming back to her like a whip. "You'll come back to me, or not at all." She pushed the energy out of her body in the same breath that she demanded it back inside her body where it had inflicted its pain on her for so long. If this agony is mine, then let it be mine in its entirety. Anova was shuddering when the consuming light and heat faded. Smoke trailed from the stone around her. The blast had reduced much of the cell's walls closest to her to rubble. Alice was standing in the far corner of it, the far ends of her chain tethers gone with the stone wall. The shackles still remained around her limbs and neck, but there was no helping that now. They had to move. Alice's lips were thin as she took in the damage around them. Her eyes stopped on Anova where the crown rested. "What have you become?" Anova swallowed. She wasn't sure what they were to each other anymore. Allies, enemies, friends, conspirators. She settled on the last. It was perhaps the least complicated, even though whatever had happened between them wasn't what she'd call easy or simple. I became what I needed to be. Her eyes went to the destruction that was the hall beyond her cell. Come on, we're going before they catch up. There was a pressure along her arm before she realized the witch was holding her there. And then what? What do you want with me? Something tightened in Anova's throat. They didn't trust each other anymore. It was beside the fact that they would both get caught and captured if they lingered here. She settled on the truth, or at least a portion of it. I need your help. It's over, Anova. Alice stood there, her chains rattling as she crossed her arms. Anova wanted to shake her. It wasn't even nearly over. Why were they still standing here? Hellmyr wanted them both imprisoned in his palace, even if her recovery bed wasn't near to the conditions of Alice's cell. We need to go, Anova said, pulling the witch forward in one motion. There was a clear path through the rubble they could take out of the dungeons, though they'd have to climb through the debris some. He's gone. Alice's words were barely audible over the shouts from Hellmyr's guards. They'd found them. Of course, I know that, Anova said in a voice that struggled to get out of her throat. But the witch had heard. Surrender your weapons! Their voices bounced off what was left of the stones. Another of them sent out the order for the Fae King. Once Hellmyr knew where she was, there would be no stopping him. At the same time, Alice turned and asked her, Am I coming with you by force? Anova understood the question even if she hated it. Are you trying to force me to do this? Since neither of them had responded to the guards' orders for their surrender, the Fae had decided to charge. After all, they were only two human girls. The Fae closest to Alice fell to his knees, clutching at his throat after Alice had flicked into his face what had appeared to be a clutch of black dust in her fist. It was enough to make the rest of the guards falter, if only for a second. Anova didn't dare waste her moment here. It was perhaps her last chance at convincing Alice to work with her. Her last chance at... Anova couldn't think the words. She betrayed you. She lied to you. Anova's heart kicked up again. But she had also betrayed Alice's trust, even if indirectly. She had trusted Hellmyr, and he had magicked the truth out of her to discover what Alice was. And there was one person left in this world who could begin to help her with the only thing left she wanted. A trade, Anova blurted suddenly. Her palms itched. The blood crown knew when she was thinking about it. Something I want for something you want. You know what it is I need. Alice's eyes cut to her. Even if what you want is impossible. Get the witch first, came the next order from one of the guards. The king has ordered her never to walk free. Anova's pulse flicked through her veins harder. He'd never consulted with her about that particular order. In fact, he hadn't shown much interest in having Anova as a ruler by his side. More as a prisoner. Her nod of assent was quick and subtle. She doubted even the Fae would have caught it. But Alice had. Alice grabbed her by the hand and jerked her backward into the stone rubble in the same moment that the witch's fist opened again. This time, a cloud of black smoke came from it and swallowed her sight whole. Chapter 48. Are you going to tell me what that was? Or was it more unexplainable witch magic? Despite their circumstances, despite the pain working into every part of her body and the Fae who were after them, Anova couldn't help but smile. Though she wasn't sure they were even on the same side anymore, Alice had always been something of a kin soul to her. She reminded Anova of a more serious Juris, and her heart hurt at the comparison. I have to believe he's safe, as long as he's far away from this. It would drive her insane to think otherwise. These thoughts left her when Alice actually snorted. She couldn't see the witch's face from where she was in front of her on the horse they rode together, but she didn't have to. "Nothing magical about it," Alice said. "Black mold. I scraped it from the walls of my cell until I had quite a collection of spores. Well, I turned it into a more inhalable smoke at the end. But otherwise, it was plain mold." Anova's brow creased. "Dramatic," she murmured, remembering the Fae's reaction to having mold blown in his face. She sniggered. Alice was quiet for a few breaths before she added, "I'm sure you've noticed. Just think on it for a moment." It took her only seconds to realize. Her mouth formed a straight line. They haven't been exposed to it here. None of them had lived in poverty. None of them had to resort to eating old, molded bread when moonlight graced them with gifts beyond imagination. All a hungry Fae had to do was snap his fingers if he wished all the fish of a lake would come to the surface. Or perhaps some of them had handled molded food before. Food stores spoil. Even moon magic couldn't stop nature's processes. Probably. But they hadn't lived like humans. Anova wasn't sure if there was anyone in the city of Urbess who hadn't handled mold, and even eaten it at points. Anova allowed the silence to build between them. There was much to say between the two of them, but there were things she wasn't ready to say out loud yet. The forests of East Woe flew past them, low branches heavy with moss grazing the tops of their heads as their stolen horse flew through the brush. This steed was one of Hellmyr's best, and she'd claimed him because she knew he had better endurance than the horses his guards would be chasing them on. They'd been riding for days, but there was still no sign of the forest she was looking for. Her heart sped in her chest at the possibility of not finding it. Alice had known what she'd wanted. She was sure it had been written on her face from the moment she'd stepped into the witch's cell. She wanted to save Cadmus. She had once talked to a long-dead Fae princess in a forest where not even her shadow had followed her. If she needed to get to the dead, the lost forest was her only lead to him. Anova had told Alice everything she knew. In return, Alice had listened and made no promises. But a strange look on her face had told Anova all she'd needed to know. There might have been a way. She didn't pester the witch for answers. Though we need to establish some things first, she considered. The farther they traveled through the lands of Fae, the less evidence they saw of its inhabitants. It was as if the world had gone quiet in shame and disbelief at what had happened at Eastwoe Palace. Anova glanced down. Their shadows had combined to form a flickering black mass that roved over the ground beside them, racing them. "Where is it?" Anova spoke. "We need to discuss the terms of this bargain." All she saw of Alice was her tightly woven hair in front of her. "We'll see to that once we find your mythical forest." Even though they were so close to one another, a necessity because they shared a horse and were being tracked by the king of Fae across his lands, Anova couldn't decipher her mood. "We can't not speak on it, Alice. I need something else to go on other than blind trust." The words came out like a flood past a dam. The stiffness came then. "I did what I had to." "What you had to? Alice, you could have told me." She was surprised by the hurt that had slipped into her vocal cords. Anova yearned to see the witch's face, but she held it straight ahead. Her companion was quiet for so long that she thought all hope for conversation had been lost. Many minutes later, Alice broke her silence. "The night they came to kill my mother, the Fae claimed they would allow her to live, if only she told them where the rest of our kind was. They argued that there were obvious signs that she was teaching an apprentice to take her place, but she never relented and told them where I was." Anova swallowed. The memories of her own mother's death pulled at her and demanded to be acknowledged. Her heartbeat raged in her chest. Maybe there's someone else I can save. For a moment, Anova felt like a scared child again. Without a home where she belonged and without the people that should have populated it. Anova's voice was rough when she spoke. She hid you from them. Alice looked straight ahead of them. It was a spell of my mother's creation and one of her finest works. I was in the hearth when they raided our house. The smell of soot disguised my scent from them, and her spell hid me from sight so long as I didn't move. She paused before adding, I was in there for 2 days before I moved. I never forgot what they said before leaving. Anova thought she knew, but she said the words anyway. What was it? With a witch alive, Fae itself would never be safe. Anova's mouth parted. She knew about the previous High King's obsession with witches, but to claim that their entire land could be threatened by one human with magic seemed a degree farther into madness. She thought then about how severely Alice had reacted when she'd told her that Alice had been mentioned in the High King's war notes. She'd been convinced a war was coming. That High King is gone, she reminded Alice. The witch in front of her looked to the side for a moment so she could see her face. Her eyebrows raised delicately above her dark eyes. So the current King of Fae would never invade our lands? Never wish to subdue our people? Anova stared ahead and tried to answer. She couldn't. For many more heartbeats, the only sound was the rustle of vegetation around them as they ripped through limbs and leaves and the gallop of their horse. Eventually, Anova found her voice. I trusted him. With secrets that weren't mine, she admitted. Even if I hadn't chosen to reveal who you were. Anova swallowed. She was trying to say something here, but she wasn't getting anywhere. Perhaps, unfortunately, Alice didn't interrupt. A shuddering breath flowed through her. It didn't have to be this hard. I was the reason you were captured by them, both times. And you trusted me. Anova schooled her burnt body into compliance. She'd been shaking. I'm sorry, Alice. Alice's response was as low as a whisper, but she heard it. I am too. Anova digested the witch's words in silence. Aches burrowed into her joints as she thought. Her body begged to be allowed to stop moving, but she ignored it. Had they been on foot, she wouldn't have made it a quarter of this distance before collapsing. Alice's quickly made ointment had soothed the worst of her burns, though she had already begun to suspect at least some of the damage was permanent. Alice spoke first, her tone careful. And you'd go through all this for one of them? For a dead Fae boy? Anova cringed at her words, though she knew they were true. He's done something like it for me too many times. In the horror and chaos that had come after she'd killed the High King, she'd been lost and on the run by herself with all of Fae after her. It was then that he'd made the damning trade with Lycasta just to find her. The same trade that had resulted in his death. You fool of a Fae. This is all conjecture, Alice murmured. You wouldn't be out here with me if you didn't think it was possible, Anova countered. She had to hold on to the belief, because without it, there was nothing left for her but a cold, empty world, along with the black crown wrapped around her head. If this place exists, then I'll do what I can. Alice's eyes narrowed on the path ahead of them. There are tales that death favors deals like the Fae do. Anova licked her lips. She knew where this was heading, but she had to be sure. And to trade for his life. It was the first they'd spoken out loud of what they were attempting, though there could be nothing else that Alice wanted greater than the crown's destruction. Anova quoted the witch's words back to her. What was once made can be unmade. They were the same words she'd spoken to her the first time they'd met. That's right. If this place exists, Alice said, her breath hitching, I'll get you in on the condition that you leave the blood crown with the dead. I've been thinking on it, and it might be the only other way to destroy such an artifact, other than the unmaking spell I created. The witch looked at her, her brown eyes catching on the light that filtered below the trees. Her teeth gleamed as she smiled. Unless you wish to sacrifice a life for your Fae boy's life. Somehow, I don't doubt that you have a list, Anova said with raised eyebrows. And that you'd refuse to do that when destroying the crown is an option. Alice smiled. Are you so sure? Anova had seen it too. There had been a flicker of something on the path before them, almost like a blink in the air. A moment later, their horse whinnied and came to a sudden, forceful stop. The misplaced energy traveled from his body to theirs, and Anova was suddenly airborne. Her flight lasted only seconds, in which she barely remembered to tuck her head close to her body. A low groan left her lips. She dared not move for the pain spreading steadily throughout her. It took her too long to realize the pain was mostly not new, and that the injuries from her burns were flaring up from hitting and scraping against the ground. She uncoiled from her balled-up position to see Alice slumped against the base of a juniper tree a few paces from her. Nowhere in sight was their stolen horse. Her heart threw itself into her throat, and she came to her feet too fast. Her vision swam, but she ignored it. Alice, she said in a strained whisper. Alice, please. Anova's hands found the witch's pulse, and it was a steady, stubborn thing. That was a start, at least. Her fingers probed Alice's head in search of any injuries, but they came away clean of blood. Alice, she repeated, holding her by the shoulder, though she remained unresponsive. Her voice pitched higher as she called her name again. Unseen injuries could be worse than the visible ones. Much worse. Don't worry about the witch. She'll be fine. At once, muscle memory took control of Anova. They'd been ambushed, and her body had known sooner than her mind could have caught up. Her claimed weapon was in her hands at once. Its blade gleamed in the filtered light, and she was back on her feet faster than should have been possible for her. But the figure on the path before them wasn't one she'd ever expected to see again. Her mouth parted in a silent gasp. It was the goblin, Rietvar. Chapter 49. He was as she'd remembered him the first time they'd met. His silver hair framed an expression that was one a host might have worn when he found his house guests already drunk upon their late arrival. What? The words stopped somewhere in her throat. Her eyes went to her feet. Her shadow was nowhere to be found. They'd made it inside the lost forest. It was at that moment that Anova remembered she owed the goblin in front of her. And then she looked from her companion to him as his words untangled in her brain. What are you doing here? She asked him. Rietvar's laugh bounced off the trunks of the trees around them. You come to my home and ask me why I'm here. Humans. He shook his head. His eyes moved to what she still held in her hands. You can lower your weapon now. She showed her teeth in an approximate smile. I don't think I will until I have some questions answered. How do you know Alice is fine? Her eyes went to her again. Did you hurt her? The question she didn't dare ask bobbed in her throat. Can you help me find Cadmus here? So serious. Rietvar's eyebrows went up. And so many questions. He looked at the witch that Anova was guarding with her body. She isn't unconscious because she hit her head. I just put her to sleep for the moment. Anova's eyes swung back to the goblin. Alarms were ringing in her head. I need more than that, Rietvar. Why? And how, she added in her head. But she was done being surprised by the Fae's abilities at this point. She knew not enough about Fae kind in general, and much less about goblins. He actually rolled his eyes. All right, enough of this. He wished to talk to you alone, if you insist on knowing why I did that. Unbidden, a breath came loose from Anova's tight throat. He? Rietvar held her stare. Not the Fae you're thinking of, your lover Fae, but the one who deals in spent lives. The one who makes deals. Anova froze. She remembered Alice's words. There are tales that death favors deals like the Fae do. He'll speak to me then. Her throat was too tight for her voice to carry, but the goblin seemed to have heard her. He agreed to your wish to speak is all. Rietvar cocked his head at her. Why else do you think you were allowed to enter this place? Allowed? That's why we couldn't find it earlier. It requires permission to find it at all. Her gaze fell on Alice again. She couldn't leave her unattended here. It was only her second time in this strange place, but who knew what other creatures lurked under the tree branches? To Rietvar, she said, I don't suppose you can make our horse come back, can you? Rietvar appeared to consider it for a moment before he said, Possibly, but I don't feel like it. Anova narrowed her eyes on the goblin. He was beginning to be a little pain. It's not far, he added. He pointed at her forehead. Though I suppose you could use that to help you carry her. She ignored the goblin's suggestion to use the crown's magic and crouched beside Alice. She wanted the witch near her for what was going to happen next, though she wished she would wake up. Anova exhaled and gathered the witch in her arms, her legs straining as she pushed against the ground. Her body's wounds pounded with blood flow in protest. She couldn't do it. Cadmus had made it look so easy, too. She stopped breathing. She couldn't think of him, at least if she wanted to hold it together in front of the goblin. Anova bit into her tongue. She would have to leave Alice here, alone, while she went with Rietvar. Even if it wasn't far, she felt like it was another betrayal. She left Alice propped against the base of the tree after reassuring herself that there was no hint of any wound or impact trauma on her. She spared one sidelong look at Rietvar. Friend, enemy, co-conspirator. The distinctions in her brain blurred. She'd better be fine. Lead me to him, Anova said, standing again. Anova recognized this place at once. It was the Fae Princess's lake. She'd been wrong, Anova realized. There had been a way to live as a human with the blood crown. She was trying to untangle what this all meant when Rietvar spoke. It's time, he said simply. He was standing several paces away from the lake. Then where is he? You haven't said how this is going to work, Anova said. She couldn't stop checking every corner of the clearing. She couldn't allow herself to relax when so many wanted her dead or captured. Rietvar's eyes were on the lake. He is most eager to meet with you, but you must pass through to the other side first. She could feel a vein in her hand twitch. Other side? She didn't like the sound of it. This is a trick. She smiled a fake sweet smile as she accused him. Rietvar smiled a fake one back. If it were, it would be a trick to eat you, and I would have by now, human. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. It wasn't that she'd forgotten his strange beast form. She just hadn't wanted to address that fact. Anova looked back at the lake. Clearly, this was the key to get to the other side. Or, he trilled, you could go back. You have a choice. You always have choices. A dry swallow sucked the last of the moisture from her mouth. He was right. She could turn back now, drag Alice out of range of this place so it no longer had a hold on either of them, and they'd be free. Probably. She didn't have to go to where the dead rested to make a deal with death. What if I never come back? Rietvar might not be tricking me, but the entity on the other side of this lake might be. Anova closed her eyes and felt warmth on her face as she angled it. The sun was high, but she knew it was false. The sun never moved here. For the first time since it had happened, Anova let herself remember him and what had happened. After all, this was the end, right? She was going to face death for his soul, and if death didn't like the idea of her stealing one of his, then what? Anova breathed out. Don't think about that. It was a relief that she could confront it at last. Cadmus's death and the fact that she'd loved him. It was all wrapped up together now. She wondered when it had happened and why. How did a heart do this to itself when it would be magnitude safer not to? What a fool heart. She breathed in. She couldn't stay here forever between life and death. Cadmus gave himself up for everyone that he loved. He tried to save me by ending the crown with his life first. Then he chose to give his brother his own life. She remembered that Cadmus had thought he'd never been the one meant to live after the massacre of his family. He thought that their places should have been switched from the start. But he was wrong. He deserved to live then, and he deserved to live now. And only she had something valuable enough to trade for his life. Maybe. She stepped forward. I'm ready. Chapter 50. Step into the lake, Rietvar commanded. Anova stepped forward as the water lapped at her ankles. She might have balked if she hadn't been an excellent swimmer. Growing up next to docks and shipyards tended to have that effect on a street rat. However, Anova wasn't ready for the lake to pull her into it. Water gushed into her lungs at once, and she fought against the force that had pulled her under. And yet suddenly, it wasn't under at all. Anova was being pulled up out of something. She broke the water with an inhale that burned. Anova pushed herself back to the edge of the lake, and she slogged out of it with coughing fits that racked her lungs. I'm going to choke him, she muttered between breaths. I'd like to see it, a voice said. Anova's gaze shot up. She was in the clearing that she'd been in with Rietvar before, but Something was wrong. Instead of midday sun streaming above, there was only an inky black sky. Not even stars dotted the heavens. This was not where she'd been before. That was when she saw him. He was a full head taller than her, with eyes as black and dull as coals. His hair was pure silver and cut to his chin. It was strange. He looked nearly human for the lack of points to his ears. His fake smile returned, and he padded from where he stood on the surface of the lake to the land. "Welcome, Anova, to the afterlife." Anova couldn't breathe. Rietvar was no mere goblin. The knowledge was enough to cause her knees to buckle, but she stopped herself before she fell down. "He's just the trickster goblin I met earlier," she tried to convince herself. "You..." It turned out she couldn't finish that thought. Even so, he correctly guessed her thoughts. Or he somehow knew, she considered with a shudder. "I have many forms." Rietvar cocked his head. "Just as I am called many names. Death, purveyor of souls, bastard." He narrowed his eyes and smiled again. It was unnerving now. Something between a laugh and an exasperated gasp escaped her. "You arranged the entire thing." She cut short her thought. Anova remembered the first time she'd met him. "Did you lure me to the Lost Forest to meet the Fey Princess?" Rietvar considered her from an angle, his chin pointing to the side. "Is this why you sought me out? To answer your troubling thoughts such as these and soothe them like some sort of balm?" "You already know why I'm here," Anova said, though the words came out softer than she'd wanted them to. She swallowed and stepped forward inside the space that wasn't the space she'd known moments before. In a louder voice, she said, "I'm here to make a deal with you." She breathed. If she was going to say the impossible, now was the time. "I need to bring back one of the deceased, back into the living realm." The face before her shifted, though his smile never faltered. Staring at her was the face of a beast, his long tusk-like teeth parting his lips in his wide grin. There was no light here, but somehow his silver fur shimmered. But his eyes never changed, she noticed. "And what is it that you offer in exchange for such a thing?" Anova focused on keeping her voice steady. She felt the weight of the crown on her head, so she knew it had come with her into the afterlife. If she had to be careful with how she phrased her bargains with the Fae, Anova had to be absolutely exacting with how she bargained with Rietvar. If she said the wrong thing or used phrases that meant something else, best not to find out. After several moments in thought, she said, "In payment for Cadmus's return to a hale life, I will give up the Fey artifact known as the Blood Crown." His grin widened. "I don't want that." Her chest was tight. She'd gotten this far and sacrificed so much to get here. She'd slipped into a space not in the living world. It took most of her willpower not to demand an explanation. It should have been enough. Fae killed each other for the object. It should have been enough of a trade for one Fae soul. But there was something else, something worse concealed under this thought. Rietvar didn't owe her anything. He didn't have to take this cursed crown from her head. Why should he? No, the worst thought was that she'd come here without anything else to offer. "What do you want?" She clenched her teeth. "Why don't you just tell me then?" She stalked to the edge of the water where he waited. As quick as the wings of a bee, her hand went to her waist. She found nothing there. Her weapon hadn't followed her to this place, she discovered too late. He hadn't missed the gesture and what it had meant, it seemed. All pretense of levity slid from his face. What I want is what any bargainer wants. A fair trade, and a deal valuable to him. Rietvar started to walk around her in a slow circle, his eyes never leaving her. How is that not fair? Anova twisted to keep him in her sights. It's one of a kind, powerful, created from a blood sacrifice. If that isn't sufficient, then tell me what you want. Rietvar licked his lips. What would my use for such a thing be? I already have all the power I need. As he spoke, his teeth clicked against each other. His canines looked too large for his already large head. I have blood sacrifices made to me daily. Anova didn't dare breathe. She wasn't sure what the answer was. Just tell me. She took a step towards him. The beast known as Rietvar stopped his pacing. His eyes pinned her to the spot. He grinned, and she knew it was as much an illusion as anything else here. You already know, Anova. Before she could speak, his voice filled the air and became heavy and droning. The sound plugged her ears so that she couldn't hear her own heartbeat. You have survived the trial of the Blood Crown. You came here and knew to seek me out. You've turned out to be more than the scared human who broke into my domain the first time. Because I am gracious, I will allow you to see the one you want. Pay my toll, and I promise to restore his lifeblood. Or refuse and come back alone. Make your choice. The beast Rietvar darted forward faster than she could process. His jaw opened to a black pit inside where his throat should have been. She didn't even have the time to draw breath before it happened. Chapter 51. Anova was on the ground somewhere. Instead of reaching for a weapon when Rietvar charged, she had reached for the slumbering power in the crown. But she hadn't been able to find it in time. She brought one hand to her throbbing burns along her other arm as she slowly sat up. It didn't make sense, so her brain rejected the vision. But the longer she sat there in silence, the more she was forced to admit that she recognized the place, even if nothing else about the situation was familiar. Mirrors lined one wall. She stared at herself, as she looked as she always did, with the cursed crown bound to her. Like she needed more than a little sleep. But now, there were her burns. Anova cringed from the vision. She hadn't properly looked at herself since almost burning alive in her funeral pyre. And she didn't want to now. Even so, she caught a glimpse. Bandages still covered much of her skin, curiously dry despite her dip in Rietvar's lake, but some had unraveled by now. Mottled red skin that looked like a map spread from under her sleeves. Anova fixed what had come undone under her sleeves as she quickly took stock of her surroundings. A bed was at one end of the room, but she didn't dare look. She knew she had to work up the courage for that. It was Cadmus's room. Somehow, Rietvar had transported her here. Or he'd really eaten her this time, and this was what the afterlife was like. She halted her raging thoughts before they overtook her. She had to breathe more evenly if she were going to stand. After a moment, she came to her feet and started to walk towards the bed. You already know, Anova. His words murmured in the back of her skull. She tried to shut out the sound, but she couldn't. When Anova saw his face, she stopped suppressing the urge any longer. She ran to him. His eyes were shut, and his lips were perfectly still. For one of the few times she looked upon his face, he wasn't wearing a hint of his usual mask of distrust and bitter sarcasm. Cadmus was laying in his bed, his hands placed on his stomach like he'd fallen asleep outside under a warm sun. Or like he's dead, another voice in her chimed, but she hated the voice for saying so. Anova came to the side of his bed. Slowly, as if he were asleep and she could wake him, she leaned over him as she looked upon him. "Why did you do that?" she whispered through a constrained throat. "You idiot." When he didn't wake up and return her insult, something ugly reared inside her. A pitiful sob rose to her lips, though she swallowed it back down. She hated Rietvar. She hated the world at large these days, but she hated the goblin-turned-death bargainer most of all. He'd brought her here just to torture her, to entice her into seeing what could have been. "You already know." She did. Because the only equal or fair trade which brought back to life a dead soul required another to die. It was simple, cold logic. To give Cadmus his life back, she would have to die in exchange. They would have no happy ending together. "Cadmus, I'm sorry," she whispered. Her lids filled with moisture, and she brought her lips to his in a silent farewell. Her heart shoved into her throat at the feeling of his lips against hers. How she'd once craved this. How she'd imagined it and relived it in her head when it had happened for the first time. It was then that his lips crushed against hers, and a strong hand found the back of her neck to pull her closer. Her eyes snapped open in shock. Cadmus was kissing her back. Adrenaline and desire flooded her veins. He was like drowning in a river that wasn't quite going fast enough for her tastes. They pulled apart for a gasp, and his lips were already red from their kissing. He got out the question first. "How are you here?" What do I say? What does he know? Her pulse pounded faster. This was going to be much harder now that he was awake. She couldn't admit what she was doing here. He'd try to stop her. So instead of saying that, she shook her head. Cadmus's eyes narrowed on her. "Another one of these dreams, then," he said in what was not quite a question, but not a statement either. Another? She didn't have time to blush. "Yes," the words squeaked out of her throat. This was what she needed to distract him. She needed some way to leave here and tell Rietvar she was going to accept his one-sided bargain. Somehow, she felt as if she'd known this from the start. That everything would come back to her saving his life one last time. His mouth widened to show his teeth. She didn't have the chance to get another word in before he pulled her underneath him. At once, Anova was assaulted by his smell. She drank it in. She wondered how it worked here. Maybe this is his afterlife, his manner. Her eyebrows came together. He must not be aware. But if this is how it is, then maybe it's not so bad here. She wondered where she would wake up. Her thoughts scattered from her brain. His mouth hovered barely over her skin, moving from the edge of her jaw to her neck. She chastised herself. Cadmus was enjoying himself, and she would too. No matter how this ended, it would be the last time either of them saw the other. "Cadmus," she whispered as she tried to cover up her shiver. "You are suspiciously good at kissing." She pretended to glare up at him. "I never asked." Who taught you? She got what she wanted out of him. His thick lashes brushed against each other as he looked down at her with a look of fake incredulity. Is it so unbelievable that I'm not naturally talented in this? His eyebrow arched as he traced her collarbone, and then traced a line that led elsewhere along her chest. Yes, she said through her teeth, though it was a terrible lie. Cadmus's grin dissolved from his face as he watched her. Is something wrong? No, not right now. Her heart threw itself against her rib cage in protest. Yes, everything. But she saw it in his face. Once she traded her life for his, and he woke up somewhere in Fae alone, his life would be as cursed as hers had been. He would never forgive her. She could see that, too. I never forgave you for what you did, either. But the words stayed in her throat. This was the real prison. No matter her choice, they couldn't make it out of this room together. Not both alive. Cadmus, she said. No matter what, she didn't want to break the spell. She wasn't sure what was safe to talk about and what would make him aware of what was coming, or that he was dead. But she thought this memory might have been safe. He'd waited for her. She continued. There's something I've wanted to know. She couldn't say the rest of it. He whispered against her skin. Tell me. Why me? The words slipped out of her. Why, the trash of the streets. His breath rushed out of him. When he spoke, he sounded furious. He moved her head so she was forced to meet his gaze. You are many things, but trash is as far from them as is physically possible. You are deadly smart, to a fault almost. You are resourceful. You are far too dangerous with a weapon. Actually, one of the things I love most about you is you can best me even without a weapon. I like that you are better than me at many things that I never would have thought I'd like being better at. Cadmus closed his eyes as if to refocus himself. But most of all, you never give up. You survive. They stayed like that for a few seconds, his eyes still closed, until he added, I think persist is the right word because it implies you fight rather than merely endure. But you have never been trash. He opened his eyes. However, I have always been an asshole. Sometimes an oblivious and stupid asshole. She smiled at him and didn't correct him. At her expression, his eyebrows came down in a mock expression of anger. You dare not contradict the last remaining member of the Wolfsbane house. His mouth went back to her neck where he peppered the skin there in tickling kisses. Cadmus, she said, the breath rushing out of her in protest between forced giggles. He doesn't remember his death, she realized. As he tickled her in his bed, she pulled his wayward mouth back to hers. To her pleasure, he gave in easily. When she pulled back for a breath, he asked against her ear, Will you be in my dream tomorrow? Her heart felt like he'd squeezed it. Somehow, this question felt more vulnerable than hers had been. You already know. It was true. She knew what she had to do now. Anova rolled Cadmus to his back and placed her head on his chest. It gave her an excuse not to meet his eyes that wouldn't have been suspicious. Yes, she said in a voice that almost didn't carry. Yes, I will. I promise. Time stretched out until she couldn't put it off any longer. Cadmus had gone still again, like he'd been when she'd found him. She was certain he was sleeping again. Anova slipped off the bed with as much care as possible. Her eyes went to the door to his room, the only way out. She knew it would take her back to Rietvar or wherever was next. It had given her the time she'd needed to think. Maybe there was a way out of this, a way for the dream to come true. She wanted this more than anything. Her eyes closed as she thought. We'd almost had it. There must be a way out for us both. She barely felt the crown on her head anymore, though it had become a permanent piece of her in so short a time. In the quiet of this room that wasn't a place and was all at once, Anova remembered the words of her enemy. Maybe there's a way. She wished the moment of peace could have lasted forever. Anova opened the door. Chapter 52.
And you've made your decision.
Rietvar was back in his human-like form. His neck cracked as he looked at her from an angle like he was still a beast. After Anova had opened the door to Cadmus's room, she'd taken one step into the hall beyond it. When she'd blinked, she'd found herself standing on the shore of Rietvar's lake again. The strange, starless night looked upon the two of them. She stared back at the shape-shifting bargainer. "You know I have," she said. "And you know what it is I'm giving you." Her heart thundered in her chest. She wasn't sure at all that this would work.
I need you to say it, Anova,
Rietvar said, his eyes greedy and burning like a furnace. Anova swallowed. There was no way around it. There was no way to trick a trickster. "In exchange for his, you'll have my mortal life," she said. Rietvar smiled.
There's a good bargain. Yes, human. I'll accept that deal.
Anova blinked again. On the ground at Rietvar's feet was a motionless body. Her heart jumped into her throat. She rushed forward, her hands already around him as she started calling his name. "Cadmus! Cadmus, please!" But this time, he was still. Anova held tight to him, even as she forced her gaze away. She could barely stand to look at him when he was like this. "You said..." The rest of her words got lost somewhere in her throat. Rietvar was gone from the lakeside. It was just her and Cadmus. And something was happening to him. He'd been not warm when she'd held him, but not cold either. By the second, he was growing colder. Anova jerked her gaze back to him despite the pain it ripped through her center. His face was growing more pallid, and she watched as the skin thinned around his face. Seconds more passed, and there was no other word for it. He was gaunt. "Cadmus! Cadmus!" she said through her teeth. It hadn't worked. There had never been any hope for a deal. It had all been a cruel joke. Never mind what she'd thought she'd figured out. She'd been wrong. She'd been ill-prepared. She'd been stupid, and the Fae had played her again. Anova hadn't realized when she'd started shaking, but she couldn't control the tremors by now. Cadmus was dying all over again in her arms, and this time, it was entirely her fault. The back of her hand wiped the tears into her skin. She needed to do something. Now. She couldn't watch him die in her arms again. Not again. In the back of her mind, the power of the crown lurked. Anova grabbed for it like she was grabbing for the light of the sun in bleak darkness. "Come to your master," she bade, and the feeling of the crown's power filled her like stinking ale. Save him! She forced the heat off her and towards him, and it traveled along her nerve endings until it jumped from her hands like a spreading brush fire. She bit into her tongue. The crown's magic funneled from her center until she became dizzy. Save his life. But something was wrong. The heat burned at her hands, biting along her skin like it resented the command. Her leashed wildcat roared in her ears, and an image of the dead High King filled her mind. She remembered that the last time she'd seen him use the crown, he'd used it to execute Iona. The realization struck her like a blow to the stomach. It can only destroy. Anova was barely breathing. The light had almost consumed her vision, and the heat was burning her all over again. It was going to destroy him for good. No, she grinded out from between her teeth. Remember how you called it back before. Remember training with Hellmyr and Lotharia. Sweat slicked her back, and the power in her hands had reached a breaking point. She couldn't contain it any longer. The thought of them was almost enough to foil her concentration, but before her focus snapped in half like a branch, the crown's cursed magic flowed back into her body. Anova's back hit the ground with a smack. The sky above her was still an empty black. They hadn't gone anywhere. She darted up again, and her heart dropped somewhere past her stomach. Cadmus was on the ground as he'd been before she'd attempted using the crown. But he was so much worse. The skin of his face was sunken in, and his eyes were like dark pits. His lips were white. She'd failed. There was nothing left. They were both going to die here. And something told her the afterlife wasn't at all like the illusion that Rietvar had conjured up to drive her to accept this bargain. And then he'd left without another word to watch her delve into insanity. It was then that she noticed. The shoreline of the lake had receded since she'd returned to the area. She could still see Rietvar's footsteps from where he'd been a beast, and they were much farther from the edge of the lake than they'd been before. It's growing smaller. Anova came to her feet as a deadly quiet overtook her. The storm raging inside her was still there, but there was something new smothering it all. The path ahead of her cleared. It was time to pay her half of the bargain. This time, she found it easy to heft Cadmus in her arms. She pushed away the concerns that gathered at this thought as well as the pain in her limbs. When she hit the water, she felt an object tucked at her waist. It was her weapon that she'd thought had been left on the other side of the lake. She didn't stop, and the water surged over their heads as she dove into the lake with Cadmus. The lake water filled her lungs at once, but she couldn't return to the surface for air without giving up. The surface of the lake above her had narrowed to the size of a tide pool. The only way forward was down, but as the water at the bottom resisted them more and more, she knew it was time to pay her due. It was time to sacrifice her life so he could pass through to the living realm. The thought that had been a whisper in the back of her skull grew louder. Maybe I can trick the trickster. Maybe I can live too. Her world blurred as the darkness closed around them. Cadmus was much too light in her arms. But she couldn't quiet the whisper. There was a way. There had to be. Anova's hand shook where the dagger was poised above her heart. Her other arm ached from keeping Cadmus by her side. He wasn't moving. She had to finish it to get him to the other side. Soon there would be no life to give up. In the greedy darkness of the lake's abyss, her body grew as cold as Cadmus's. Her veins were like ice. I'm drowning. It was this infiltrating numbness and cold that reminded Anova of the belladonna's grip on her sluggish heart. During the blur of the poison spell, she'd felt as if she'd already died and had been trapped inside her cooling corpse. There were voices, she remembered. Hellmyr. As darkness glimmered at the edges of her vision, she realized they were both fading. Her arm relaxed her grip on Cadmus, and he floated from her. The blade in her hand nearly slipped from her fingers. There's a way. There's a way. Hellmyr's words filled her empty head. Help me understand. It was working. She was starting to change. Change. Anova reached for the slumbering power of the crown at the same time that she steadied the dagger in her fist. I'll accept you. All of you, she spoke into the silence. Anova plunged the knife into her heart, tearing open her flesh. At the same moment, Cadmus opened his eyes where he faced her in the water. Chapter 53. Too much happened at once. The burning in her lungs combined with the searing pain from the wound, but she didn't stop. Cadmus focused on her face, then her bleeding chest. Anova. No, he mouthed. He reached for her, but the lake had already taken hold of him. A rush of water pummeled his chest, dragging him down, or rather to the other side. Her energy seeped from her, and red twisted around her like snakes in the water. She was dying. Blood gurgled to her lips. Her body was finally failing her. No! This time, she heard Cadmus's scream through the dark waters. His arms fought the currents, but it couldn't be stopped. It had already accepted him. He was going to live. Tears blurred her vision as her body refused to move any longer. Her plan wasn't working. The darkness clouding around her had almost stolen the sight of Cadmus from her. Despite the futility of it, he was fighting the force bent on keeping the bargain she'd made. They locked eyes, and Anova saw it then. Somehow, he loved her. Her weak heart sputtered and thrashed. He loved her so much that this was going to destroy him. It has to work. Even if she had to give up her humanity for it, she was going to survive. Persist. Screams pierced the dullness beating against her ears. It wasn't long until the screams started to form words. No. 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 Please. But this wasn't Cadmus. Anova fought to clear her vision. These were the screams that had haunted her nightmares since she was 12 years old. If only she could find her mother here. She would give up anything to give her the life she was robbed. But as the screams repeated, and her hands found only dark water, Anova stopped. She's not here. It's an illusion. Anova shut her eyes. If that's so, then why does it hurt so much? I'm sorry, Mother. I'm sorry I couldn't stop the Fae from killing you. Then why are you allowing it to make you one of them? Her eyes opened as pain lit her nerves on fire. Where it wrapped around her head, the blood crown felt like it was constricting her flesh, biting into it with each second. Cadmus was almost too far away to see, and she realized she was on the bottom of the lake while he was at its surface. He'll be saved. He'll live. Her heart soared as if it could catch up with him. I don't have time to save myself anymore. Anova tried to shout, but water filled her mouth instead of air. That voice wasn't her mother. She would want me to live, she argued in the cacophony of her head. She would want better dead than a monster. Better to be rotten than something you hate. No, This was her mother's voice, but Anova knew she wouldn't want her daughter dead. Even if I have to do the unthinkable, she would want me to live. Anova's fingers curled around the black metal. It was too tight against her skin and would soon break past it. "Stop using her voice! That's not her!" she screamed at the voice. "Are you sure, Anova?" And she was there, floating above her. Her clothes and hair were lifted and dragged along by the waters that kept Anova at the bottom. She was exactly as she'd remembered her. Her honey-brown hair cascaded around her heart-shaped face with delicate cheekbones and arched eyebrows. "Come with me, darling." Her mother extended her hand to her. She might have been pale, but she didn't look like Cadmus had when she dragged him into the lake, gaunt and plucked of life. Anova's eyes filled with tears. Her body was so cold already. She couldn't really take more of it. And how bad could death be if she was with her? Before their hands met, Anova looked down. In her mother's extended hand was the blade she'd lost in the depths of the dark lake. She looked back to her face. "It won't hurt for long," her mother promised. Anova nodded. Her belly constricted around swallowed water, and her throat tightened around the words she couldn't say. She accepted her weapon and took it in her fist. With her wounds and the water in her lungs, she should have been dead already, but the crown had kept a part of her alive. It was the same part that Hellmyr had manipulated her into forming. The part of her life that was intertwined with Fey magic. As the tip of the blade touched the bleeding wound on her chest, she faced her mother. "I don't hate him." Anova stuck the weapon deeper this time, pushing past sinew and muscle. At the same time, a new energy surged through her, replacing the lifeblood she'd lost to the abyssal darkness around her. Anova followed the feeling, and opened the block between her and it, the block keeping her safe from what was on the other side. "Take this body, all of it." Above her, her mother dove for her with extended hands. In a blink, her face changed. She was no longer her mother, but a stranger with a furious expression in her dark eyes and layers of necklaces around her throat. She'd never seen her before, but she knew who this was. "Witch," she mouthed to her as she moved out of her grip. A name bubbled to the top of her brain. Gwenor. "I couldn't save him from becoming one of them, so I let it happen." Gwenor's lips pulled down when her lunge didn't touch Anova. "I saw his death and allowed it, but I couldn't let them get away after killing my boy, so I cursed them with power." She smiled. "And suspicion, paranoia, death." This was the witch who had created the blood crown with her revenge spell. Anova's heart was too slow. She'd lost too much blood. "I can't fight her," she realized as her body tremored in pain. Gwenor's eyes narrowed on Anova. "But my creation was never meant for this." The witch lunged for her throat before she stopped speaking. But before she could touch her, Anova allowed the crown's magic to blaze through her veins like fire. Her own screams filled her head as Anova dug the knife deeper into her heart, and black eclipsed her vision. When the last of her life left her body in the deepest part of the Black Lake, an overwhelming quiet smothered her. But not before she heard the voice of someone else entirely. It was that of a goblin she'd met in the wood surrounding a lake.
You will pay me what I am owed, one way or another.
Chapter 54. You woke her up. I told you that you were clattering them. Anova opened her eyes. She knew that voice. Maris, she breathed. She shot up. Her surroundings were familiar too, although they didn't make sense. She was in her bedroom in Wolfsbane Manor. Soft morning light streamed through her window. Her bed was plush and warm. Maris and Della were at her side, and the latter started speaking at once. Anova, she gasped. A sheepish look crossed Della's face as she talked to her headboard rather than her. I may have been a little loud on purpose, she bit her lip, to see you awake at last. But her mother's friend's face had been so full of pure joy that Anova found herself grinning so wide it hurt. Please, don't be sorry. I'm relieved you're safe, and I'm glad to be. Anova's eyebrows came together. Was she alive? Awake? Here, she finished awkwardly, though the other two didn't seem to notice. She swallowed a bulge in her throat. There were too many questions for her to get out, but it was the first that could be the most painful. Her memories inside the lake played at the edges of her mind, taunting her. Which had happened, and which had been a nightmare? Della, Maris, there's something I need to know. Ever the open book, Della's face went white. Anova's hands clamped around her upper arms. She said in gasps, He can't be. At the same time, Della sputtered out, He said he wanted to be here when you saw, to explain it. Anova slumped against her headboard. She blinked. He's alive. Cadmus is alive. At the same time, her hands wandered to her head where she found the blood crown still planted there. It wasn't all she found. Anova darted to her feet. Where's a mirror? I need one. He said, Della started again. Anova, Maris said at the same time, but Anova easily slipped out of her range of grasp before she could stop her. The mirror was where it had been when she'd lived there. A cloth had been thrown over it. Like that was going to stop her. The fabric was lying in a heap on the floor before either of the other two could get to her. Anova stood there, watching herself touch her ears that came to sudden tips. Watching the Anova in the mirror examine how her eyes shifted in the light. She kept looking until she found the angle where she could see her mother's eyes in her own. But maybe she was seeing what she wanted to. Anova slid to the floor and joined the fabric piled there. Anova, Della gasped, crouching beside her. I'm so sorry. Cadmus went out to patrol the land here, but he said he wanted to be here to tell you before you saw, to explain it all. Anova shook her head. They didn't understand. Maris joined her on Anova's other side. Her soft hands found her face and pushed her hair behind one of her fey ears. You're in shock, she said quietly. I'm alive, and so is he. Who cares if I am? Anova threw her head back and started to laugh at it all. Her body shook with convulsions. Her throat felt raw, but she didn't think she wanted to stop laughing. It was supposed to have been impossible. She could feel the other women's eyes on hers and the concern radiating from them. For their sakes, Anova allowed her laughs to come to a stop. Her voice was rough when she spoke again. Sorry. Anova swallowed. So my plan worked. He's alive. I'm alive. All of us. Maris nodded once. She seemed to choose her words carefully. Whatever you did in that lake, he's alive again. What Della said was right. He left a few hours ago to ensure this area was secure. Anova squeezed one of each of their hands. And you too. You're really okay? Yes. Neri got us out of the palace. Della grinned. And then he found your Fae boy and you. Neri? Anova wondered out loud. I had anticipated it to be harder to steal 2 prisoners from the Fae King himself, a voice said behind her. Anova twisted to see Nerium in the doorway of her room. A wry expression was beginning to form at the edge of his mouth and his eyes. He continued as he walked forward. He was a fool to underestimate these 2. Maris and Della helped Anova to her feet. Della's grin was wide as she said, You're going to have to show us some of those tricks again. Anova couldn't believe it. If she hadn't, moments ago, seen something just as impossible in the mirror, she wouldn't have believed it. Nerium was blushing. As Della and Maris helped her dress for breakfast, Anova avoided looking in the mirror. She felt that the other 2 saw and understood. I'm alive, she repeated to herself. That's what matters more. But there were other things that mattered too. Like not recognizing the girl in the mirror. Or rather, the Fae in the mirror. But as they helped steady her while she slipped out of her shirt and pants, Anova couldn't help but see the body below her. She sagged at the sight, and breath rushed out of her. Anova, it's okay, Maris urged. Her voice rose uncharacteristically. You're going to be okay. Anova gave another shake of her head. No, it's not that. She leaned against one of her bedposts. A tear ran along her cheek. Della tried to touch her but retracted her hands at the last second. Probably because of the burn scars along her body. I'm sorry, Anova, she said again. I know it's... Anova met her eyes. I'm glad. It's me. A strange note had entered her voice at the last 2 words. I'm glad they stayed on me. Della nodded, and she hoped she understood. It was maybe the last part of her that she had left to prove who she'd been. Even if the scars were a symbol of when she'd nearly been burned alive on her funeral pyre. A symbol of humanity, then. The Fae were beautiful and flawless and ageless. But then, maybe she was something else. Not human, not quite Fae. When Anova descended the stairs of the manor in a soft, shimmering dress that was either blue or gray depending on the lighting, someone was waiting for her. Cadmus ran to her and spun her in a circle across the parquet tile floor. In her ear, he whispered, You must know by now that I'm going to have to prove my natural skill to you. My pride won't allow me to accept the insult gracefully. Anova looked at him quizzically until she remembered. It was our conversation while he was in the afterlife. He remembered. And then she remembered the kiss they'd shared. She pulled his mouth to hers to give him the chance to prove it. Chapter 55. In a dark wood, a witch rode on horseback. Strapped to the horse and her were bags of salt and all the food she'd managed to find on her own, which wasn't much to begin with. She itched to look around her, but more important than keeping an eye out for them was keeping the horse on a path not directly intersecting a tree trunk. She knew it was the wrong decision when she felt it in the back of her skull where her magic slept. Something was coming for her. A dry swallow scratched her throat. Damn all of you. There was no time for spells or curses, even if she had the proper materials or time for such a thing. She whispered calm words to the horse, though she wasn't sure if it did him any good. She gritted her teeth as she considered it. They might kill him for sport when they didn't find her. The witch cut open one of the bags of salt so that the horse was covered in it. It would buy him a little time from their horrors. She leaped from his back the instant before a low branch struck her in the face. As she climbed to the top of the juniper tree, she watched the last stores of her food and spell materials ride off without her. Bright flares of fey magic lit the woods below her as the Fey King's soldiers looked for her. Alice looked to the pale moon hanging in the night sky above her as she considered her next steps. She never forgot a promise or betrayal. This concludes A Crown for the Cursed by Joy Lewis. Narrated by Grace Noble. Copyright 2023 by Joy Lewis.